Hello, everyone. Welcome to our YouTube Live. I hope you guys can all hear me okay. I can see that a lot of you have joined today. So again, welcome and thank you for taking the time to come here. Can I just get a quick react or a message if you can hear me fine, if everything's going okay? Just having a look at the chat now. Yes, okay, wonderful, fantastic, good to hear. Thank you for responding. We'll just be starting in a couple of minutes just to allow a chance for all the students and parents to connect. Now, as I'm sure many of you have discovered, this is a live session, which means that you can actually communicate with me just through the chat function. So I think towards the right of your screen, you can see a little text box there. So feel free to use that if you have any questions throughout the session. Bear with me 1 second while I just share my screen. Okay, wonderful. My name is Harsha. I'm one of the directors of the Alpha One Parramatta branch. Today's YouTube Live will mainly be just focused on some tips and tricks and some last minute advice that you need to go before the selective test. As I said, we'll just give everyone a couple more minutes to join us today. While we're waiting, I just want to share some information. So for anyone who's not in Year 6, we actually do have Term 2 enrollments which are now open. So anyone that's in Year 5 and below, just some information about our classes. These are small group classes where we typically have about 8 students in class. These classes are all taught by specialized tutors from top schools. There's a variety of different courses that are suited to your child's needs. There's classes like the foundations lesson, which focus on a more fundamental level of mathematics and just cover the more basic core skills that they have to know. Then there's the WMT lessons, which is where we start gearing into proper OC and selective style lessons. WMT just stands for writing, English, maths, and thinking skills, these being the 4 main subjects in the selective exam and the OC test as well. It's a comprehensive course where we basically teach them all the relevant theory that they need to know for these highly competitive exams. And just knowing the theory alone is not enough. Once they get to a certain stage where the students feel a bit more confident, we also do offer trial test lessons, which are all about refining their exam technique. So that's the other type of class that we have. If you're interested in any of these lessons, we do have branches in Bella Vista, Parramatta, Epping, and Burwood. So feel free to reach out to your local branch. I'm sure they'd be very happy to help you choose the best type of class for your child, and of course, organize a free trial lesson. Now, I understand that most of the students joining us today are in Year 6. So, if you're in Year 6 and we're waiting for the selective test coming up in May, we're excited to say that we also have these selective trial test packages that are now online on our website. If you go to the resources section on the top right of our website, you can find the trial test platform. At this stage, a lot of students would really benefit more from doing mock exams under exact test conditions. And I'll talk through about, all the different strategies that will help you refine, your exam technique and your consistency, right in the lead up to the selective test. This platform is, fantastic just for giving you that final push before the test and to give you some, extra practice again, with the actual selective test style questions under exam conditions. These exams will be automatically, graded, and there is a countdown timer, so it is time limited to the same again, structure of the selective exam, and you can always go back and have a look through the mistakes that you've made and learn from them. So definitely have a look at that. We also do have a Facebook page, which is the selective selective test discussion group. That one includes plenty of practice materials, worksheets, and all sorts of different resources that you'll find helpful, I'm sure. And there are also some WeChat groups. We'll put all these things in the description below. Like I said, they have free materials, monthly challenges, and a host of different resources that I'm sure you'll find very helpful. With that in mind, we'll get started on the session. So again, welcome to this YouTube live that we're hosting. We're here today to take a deep dive into all the last minute tips and tricks that you need to ace your selective test in May. I'll be sharing some of the tried and tested strategies that I've been personally giving students over the past 10 years of helping out kids in year 6 achieve their selective goals. And we really want to just make sure that we can maximize your performance on the day of the exam. Now, remember, that includes staying consistent with your progress, managing all your nerves and things like that just prior to the exam, and really just being very focused with your progress in practice. On the day of the exam, of course, the most important thing is to maintain that sharp sense of focus and maintain your accuracy through the test. And obviously, time management is a critical element. If you're watching this live in real time, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I'm sure you'll find the real-time question and answer session helpful. So if you have any questions throughout the session, you can just use the chat function on the right, and I'll try my best to clear up questions as we go through the session. There's a lot of questions that parents have which are relevant, and I'll just try and answer them on the spot. If the questions take they just require a slightly more detailed answer, and the much more bigger questions, then we'll leave those towards the end of the video. So like I said, you're welcome to ask questions throughout the session, but the bulk of the Q&A will sort of be after we go through everything that we're trying to get through today. I'm just having a quick look at the chat now. So some parents are asking how long this session will be. Roughly about an hour and a half, just to get through, again, the main content that we want to focus on, and then an additional 20 to 30 minutes at the end just to answer up any other questions that parents have. The trial test package is a downloadable or online. I believe it's an online only test practice, but you can find more information about that on the website itself. Now, in terms of what we're going through today, if you are, this session will be automatically recorded, and you can go back and watch this as many times as you like. There's a few slides that will be useful for you to just go back and refer to. So we've tried to structure it in a way that you can easily find the parts that are most relevant to you. We'll be starting with what students should be focusing on right now, which is about 6 weeks before the exam. And then we'll get to the most important advice for what you should be doing roughly 1 week before the test. A lot of students, combat nerves, on the night before the exam. So we'll go through some strategies for how to, help you out with that. And then what to look out for on the day of the test itself. And we'll wrap up with just a few tips and tricks for each subject in the exam itself. So English, maths, thinking skills, and writing. Like I said, at the end, there will be a Q&A session also. For those of the parents who have just joined us right now, I'm Harsha. I'm the director of the Alpha 1 Parramatta branch. I graduated from James Roos, and I've been helping students achieve their goals for the past 10 years. We'll dive straight into this session so that I can help you get there too. Okay, so what happens right now? What is it that, a lot of parents ask me, what's the best thing that we should be doing right now? It's about 6 weeks to go until the exam. How do we make the best use of the limited and precious time that we have left? Now, remember that the test is on the 9th of May. Well, over the next hour, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share with you some of the secrets of the best performing students, the ones that ended up scoring in the top 10% of the selective exam and were able to comfortably get into their, first and sometimes second preference of schools. And for all the students here today, I just want you to think about and try and understand what was unique about the ways of thinking and the styles of practice of these students that helped them achieve enormous success in previous years. Well, the first trait of all these students is that they were practicing a minimum of 2 complete test papers under actual test conditions every single week. That way, on the day of the exam, they weren't stressed out that, the selective test was the one big exam, something that, they've been tirelessly toiling away at for the past 1 year. They don't think, oh man, this is the big exam. My parents keep saying that, my whole future depends on it. I've spent so much time and effort and things like that. They don't think like that on the day of the test, right? It's actually much more simple. The students that perform the best on the exam have done so many practice papers before that on the day of the test, they weren't stressed out by all these other thoughts. All they were thinking was, oh, well, I've done at least a dozen of these tests before. Today's just test number 13 or test number 17 or 21 or 25. That really takes a lot of pressure off the exam itself. Remember, one of the most important things to realize is that you can't work some sort of miracle on the day of the exam where, you haven't been doing any sort of practice tests or anything, but suddenly on the day of the test, you're gifted with amazing focus and brilliant time management. It just doesn't really work that way, right? What actually happens is that you've practiced the exact same style of questions in the same time constraints as the actual selective test, and you've done that over and over until the process has become rehearsed. To give you an analogy, it's like you wouldn't jump on stage at the opera house and just start singing solo out of the blue, knowing that the only practice you've done is just singing in the shower, right? And it works exactly the same way, right? What you would do instead is you'd get up to sing on at least a few different, podiums and stages and prepare, and then that way stage fright won't bother you the same way. Selective exam, like I said, works exactly the same way, right? Practice makes perfect, and the right kind of practice is what really makes the right kind of, performance that you're striving for. Now, a lot of students, when I tell them this, they say like 2 mock exams, that's a lot. Like that sounds like a lot of work. It's about 8 hours of additional practice. But the good news is that if you put in the hard yards now, you can relax as much as you want after the next 6 weeks, right? It's like when you look at, all these runners on marathons and things like that, they don't slow down when they reach the finish line. They actually speed up. And that's kind of the same stage that we're at. Another thing is, if it seems like a lot of work, be reassured that if you have done, or if you're currently doing courses like the selective trial test classes, the STTC, that one has about 2 subjects each week, which is roughly about half an exam. So, you're expected to do at least 2 full papers. About half of them are being done in classes. That leaves a bit of, less work to be done at home. Now, in terms of exactly how to practice, you want to fall into a routine that's similar to what will happen on the day of the selective test itself. So let me give you another strategy that a lot of these high-performing students have benefited from in the past. This is, an example of a timetable that, an average student might follow. And it's a really good template to have for when you have something like, say, a Saturday or Sunday morning of available time. So what you want to be doing is, like I said, you want to follow the exact same conditions as the real selective test. Now, on the day of the exam, which is the 9th of May, you're expected to get to the exam center about 8:45 in the morning. Around 9 o'clock, they'll have everyone lined up, and then you'll go inside, you'll get all these instructions, you might do some like sample questions, they'll give you the bubble sheets. And once all those formalities are done, typically the reading paper starts at 9:30 in the morning, right? Then what happens is, after you complete the reading paper, they give you the maths paper, right? They'll give you the thinking skills paper after that, and then the writing paper, and there will be breaks between each of these subjects. Between reading and maths, and between thinking skills and writing, you tend to have shorter breaks. Between maths and thinking skills, you tend to have a long lunch break. And you want to get into the same rhythm when you're practicing at home. So you can see from this timetable over there that, let's say on a weekend morning, if you have Saturday or Sunday morning free, you're going to try and do the reading paper from 9:30 to 10:10, and then take a break for a solid 10 minutes, right? In the exam hall, this would be the time that they would spend collecting the reading papers and handing out the maths papers. Then after you've done the math section, take a decent lunch break, about half an hour. And then after you've done the thinking skills paper, same thing, give yourself like a 10 to 15 minute break before you do the writing section. All right. Now, the writing paper, you can see that the time there is 12:25 to 12:55. That's a useful time frame to have, because remember, when you do the writing test, you want to aim for about 5 minutes of planning time, so that you can actually, have a lot of depth and detail to your response. And then it should be pretty comfortable to fill up, at least 1.5 to 2 full A4 pieces of paper in 25 minutes. But we'll talk a lot more about, specific tips and tricks for the writing section towards the end of this video. If you're wondering where you might be able to find more tests, so a lot of students are wondering, okay, well, you've asked me to do about 2 mock exams. I'm going to try and aim for about 3 mock exams each week. Where am I going to find, 18 different sets of practice materials? But that's okay. I've got you covered. There are a few different sources that I can personally vouch for as being good examples of questions that are very relevant to the current format of the selective exam. Okay. So the first one is, if you go to our website, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have recently launched a selective trial test platform where you can purchase exam packs. You can either buy these test papers by subject, so just reading papers, maths papers, or thinking skills papers, or you can buy the full set that includes all of the different papers. And like I said, if you go onto the website, you can find out all the information about that. So that should give you plenty of exam style practice. Some other resources that may be helpful. So there's a bookstore called 5 Senses. I think they have 2 branches in Seven Hills and North Rocks. Not personally affiliated with them. I don't get paid anything to recommend these textbooks or anything like that. But the reason I do recommend them is because, again, the types of questions that you find in these particular books by Yvonne Kang are very relevant to the current format of the exam. They're about the right level of difficulty. So these also have some additional mock exams that you can use. And if you need even more tests than that, and if you need, like water that's bottled at the source, then on the Department of Education's website, you can actually find past papers from last year, the year before, and 2021, as well as a sample test. And because these were the actual selective test papers, they're going to be, the closest thing to what you can expect for your exam as well. I would try and leave these to about 2 weeks before the selective exam, before you attempt these, because like I said, they're the most relevant papers that you can get. But that's also, all these sources should cover you for more test papers, test paper practice that you can do. I'm just having a quick look at the questions over here. So, okay, we'll get back to some of the questions towards the end. Now, secrets of high-performing students again. So remember I said that one of the keys is to make sure that you allocate enough time to do a sufficient number of mock exams. And I mentioned weekend mornings because that's pretty much the only time where you'll get a dedicated chunk of time from say 9 a.m. till about 1 p.m. to actually do selective test practice, because your real test will be from 9 a.m. to about 1 p.m. Another secret of high-performing students, right? A psychological trick from the students that get pretty much in the top 10% is that they actually look at mistakes as an opportunity to learn, right? Whenever they see a few reds on their paper, they actually use this to gather feedback, right? They don't get disheartened. They think to themselves that every mistake that they make before the exam is one less mistake that they can make on the day of the test itself, right? For you, every time you do any sort of question and you get it wrong, that's actually even more valuable than the questions that you get correct, because it teaches you what you can avoid on the day of the test itself, right? Just make sure that every mock exam you do is followed up by a detailed review session where you actually go through the test, look at all the mistakes that you've made, and you have a clear understanding of why you made the mistakes that you made, right? So once you've actually figured out, where things are going wrong, and, let's just say that that happens over the course of the weekend when you do mock exams, then comes the question of, how you should be spending your time during the week. And the best thing that you can do is to take the weaker points that you found out through these mock exams and undertake drills or short exercises during the week, just to become more confident with them. Parents were asking, students were asking, what do I mean by 2 complete papers? I basically mean, one full exam that goes reading, followed by maths, followed by thinking skills, followed by writing, one after the other in the same pattern as selective test, and aim for about 2 of these full papers, right? So all 4 of these tests completes 1 paper, and then you want 2 of them. Now, some students also ask, okay, what is it about these drills? How do I actually, put them into effect? Well, like I said, high-performing students, what they're able to do is look at the mistakes that they've made and actually learn from them and use them to build their confidence. So that also includes revising concepts, revising mathematical theory, and just, undertaking a variety of different exercises during the course of the week to improve with them. And I'll give you some practical tips on what exactly I mean. So it's not feasible to actually study every single day, right? Here's a sample timetable for a student. Just a particular student, your timetable might look very similar to this. And you can see that this child, he has free time on Monday to dedicate just towards studying, right? Then on Tuesday, this child is doing, swimming and taekwondo and other, very sporty extracurriculars. It means they're going to be really, really tired when they come back from these activities. They can't really study that day, and that's completely fine, right? Then you can see that on Wednesday, they actually have more than enough time to undertake 1 full mock exam, which is really good. Yes, it's sort of towards the evening. Maybe they're doing their mock paper from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. But just the fact that they can squeeze in a full test into that time is really, really good, right? And you should definitely aim for that if you have a couple of weeknights free. Then Thursday and Monday evenings and also Saturdays are basically their study days. So these are the days where they will undertake these drills or these practice exercises to improve in the weaknesses that they've been able to identify from the exams, right? Again, Fridays are a bit of a write-off. They have all these music lessons, extracurriculars. Maybe they go to Alpha 1 classes like STTC. Doesn't leave a lot of extra time for study. And then come Sunday, that's another full day that they have to just focus on selective test preparation. So on Sunday, what they're going to do is 1 full mock exam from, again, 9:30 till about 1 o'clock. And then they will revise and review the questions in the afternoon. Okay? Now, the biggest question that a lot of students ask is, what happens on these study days? What specific activities should I be undertaking on those days? How can I actually, effectively use my time on those evenings to actually improve from each exam? Remember, if you just keep doing mock exam after mock exam, there's a good chance that you'll find certain mistakes and keep repeating these same mistakes, right? Your confidence is not going to improve by repeating the same mistakes. However, if you actually undertake dedicated study days, that's your chance to see improvement from, again, all the weaknesses and mistakes that you've found that you've had from the mock exams, right? Let's look at, again, how you would spend a typical study day to optimize your skills with the subjects. So here's a student that comes back from school, say around 3 p.m., 3:15 or 3:30. Right? Once you come back from school, obviously you're going to need a bit of time to unwind, maybe watch some TV for a bit, grab a snack, and just get into the headspace that you need to actually, study efficiently. A lot of students also ask, how can I beat procrastination, or how can I make sure that I don't get distracted, or I really want to have like a balanced evening. How can I make sure I can factor in all these other things? So you'll see that a timetable like this is really good for achieving all of that. Right? Procrastination usually happens when you've got, say, if I asked an average student to study from, say, 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., they're going to find that really difficult, right? Even if you ask me to study from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., I'm going to have a tough time focusing continuously for 5 hours, right? And the temptation is there to sort of, go and do something else in the meantime, or to put it off until 6 o'clock or something like that. So instead, we're going to have a daily timetable like this, which balances everything out. So they've had enough time to come back from school, unwind, take it easy for a bit. And then come 4:15, this student is, in the zone. They're ready to study. From 4:15 to 5:15, this child is chosen to work on their writing section, right? Maybe that's one area that they find they're a bit weaker at. So they want to spend a good amount of time on their writing skills. So from 4:15 to 5:15, they're going to take 1 hour just to do a 30-minute writing piece in the same format as the selective exam. Remember that on the day of the test, you get 30 minutes to attempt writing. And then after that, they're going to try and mark their own writing piece, right? This is really, really important. Again, another secret of high-performing students is they're not entirely reliant on other people to mark their writing piece, right? Think about it. If you're always waiting for someone else to go through your writing piece and give you scores and things like that, then you're not going to have that person on the day of the exam. It's a really, really valuable skill to be able to look at your own writing piece and see, okay, these are the areas that I need to improve in. My introduction is a bit weak. I need to have more depth and detail into my, first body paragraph. Right? So once you've completed the writing piece, I highly encourage all the students to try and look through their own writing work and give themselves a mark out of 25, and also give yourself some feedback in terms of things that you've done well and things that you need to improve on. Right? If you've done any sort of mock exams with us before, or WMT classes, you'll see that the markers actually, give you a score. They give you things that you need to improve on, and they give you things that you've done well. And the back of your booklets also have a marking criteria, which you yourself can actually use to see how good your writing piece is and see what things you need to improve on, right? So that's what this child has done. They've spent half an hour writing, then they've spent, another 15 minutes going through their piece and, marking it, and then another 15 minutes trying to see what things they could have improved on and maybe making in those edits, before they ask someone else to read through it, right? That was 1 hour of study. Now they deserve to take a break, right? And a decently long break is how, again, we can make sure that you don't get too fatigued and you don't lose focus, throughout the evening. So what does this person do? Well, from 5:15 to 6, they take an active break, right? So they go outside, they play some sports, they go for a walk, they take their dog to the dog park. Their parents have just come back from work, so they spend some time with their family. It's just a nice 45-minute reset. And in response to the question that I'm just getting here, what is a key to prevent burnout or exam fatigue leading up to the exam? As I mentioned, a timetable like this, which balances, things like, active time, play time, entertainment, food and snack breaks with a good amount of study is the best way of making sure that you don't get too tired over the course of the evening, and that, you spend the next 6 weeks, still treating this like a marathon. Right? If you spend the next 2 weeks treating it like a sprint and you do heaps and heaps and heaps of work over the next 2 weeks, there's a good chance that you don't want to do anything for the next 4 weeks after that, right? Having a balanced timetable like this is a really good way of making sure that, you're not going to procrastinate the things that you need to do, and you don't get burnt out in the process. Another question: why is it called an active break? Just a term that I like to use. There's things like a passive break where you just sit there and watch TV. You're not being very active. I think it's really, really important that you actually go outside, spend some time in nature, spend some time playing sports, getting your heart rate up, because exercise is proven to actually improve your brain function. So stay active during that break is what I would recommend. Why is it from 5:15 to 6? Well, just because these days the sun starts to set a little bit early, so you want to try and get this out of the way before 6 p.m. From 6 to 6:50, what does this student do? So they're undertaking a thinking skills drill. Now, on that note, parents are also asking, what is a drill? So it's like this. Let's say the selective test is like a soccer match, right? If you just go out there and keep playing like a soccer match after soccer match, you're not really going to improve, right? Especially if you know that there are certain weaknesses that you have. For example, you're a bit weaker with shooting the ball into the goal, or you're very weak at, passing the ball between teammates. So what are you going to do to improve those skills? You're going to undertake drills, right? A drill is basically just one, focused activity that you do over and over until you become confident with that activity. So, if you know that your weakness is with passing the ball between your teammates, then for one session, all you do is just keep dribbling the ball back and forth, from you to a friend, right? Or if you're weak at, shooting the ball into a goal, then all you're going to do is just keep kicking the ball into the goal over and over. Right? And that's how you sort of, build up all these little pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that you then put together into forming that soccer match. In this case, that's the selective test. So the student is doing a thinking skills drill. They found out when they did their mock exams that they're really struggling with the mathematical style questions of thinking skills, the ones that have problem solving questions. So for the next, say 20 minutes, all they do is just, they give themselves, say 20 minutes, they just do 20 questions, and all of these questions are related to problem solving questions and thinking skills, right? That's all they do. They're not touching the, the nonverbal reasoning, shape style questions. They're not touching the logical reasoning or the argument questions or anything like that. They're just focusing on mathematical problem solving, right? Because as they go through this, they spend 20 minutes, they do 20 questions. Of course, it's normal to make more mistakes. Then they spend the next 20 minutes going through these mistakes, and that's how they learn how to avoid, errors with these mathematical problem-solving questions. And as you do more and more of these, you get more confident as well. And that's what they've decided to do for those 50 minutes, right? 50 minutes is a decent amount of time to concentrate. It's more time than you need to concentrate on the day of the test in one go. Yes, the selective test goes on for about 4 hours, but you do get breaks in between each subject. So make sure you give yourself breaks when you're practicing at home as well. This student has taken a quick break for about 10 minutes. And then they realized that when they did their reading test, they got all the questions correct, except the questions in the poem, right? Every question that they touched in the poetry section, they really struggled with, right? They didn't really fully understand the main idea of the poem or the figurative or metaphorical meaning. So what do from 7 to 7:30? They choose a poem, then they read it, they annotate it, they write little notes on the poem, they try and figure out what the main idea is. Maybe they have a look at the title to see if there's any clues to what the rest of the poem is about. Maybe they write a few 2 or 3 sentence summaries of the poem itself. And then they need some way of going and checking if they've understood correctly. So, there are some really good websites that you can go online to do that. One great website is called poemanalysis.com. So maybe the student goes onto that website and tries to check if their detailed analysis matches up with what was written on the website. Maybe they go to YouTube and they type in the name of the poem and write analysis after that, and then they can see a tutor actually go through and review that poem. But there's lots of different strategies for things like this. So from 7 to 7:30, all they do is focus on the poetry section, and then they take another break, right? You notice that from 7:30 to 8, they're not doing any actual, dedicated practice. They're taking a good amount of break time before they just do something light for the last half an hour of the day, right? So from 8 to 8:30, maybe the student is naturally very strong with maths. So all they're doing is just some light revision of different maths questions that, they've just made a couple of mistakes in. So in this case, it was graphs and tables. So maybe they're just choosing about 10 to 15 graphs and tables questions from maths and just going over their strategy for that. Okay, I hope that section made sense. I'm just going to have another quick look at the questions and see if Anyone's put up anything else that I can answer right away? Can I receive a recording of this video? Yes, absolutely. So this video will be recorded and it will be put up on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and refer to it later on. In fact, like I mentioned, we'll be going through different stages over the next 6 weeks. So, one of them will be what to do the night before the test, or, how to think through the exam on the day of the exam. So, these are things that would be handy for you to go back and refer to. So the recording will be available for sure on our YouTube channel. And then there's a few more questions on seeing improvement with individual subjects, so I might answer those towards the end. Is the selective test paper online or is it on paper? This year's exam will be on paper. That has been confirmed. So they will have a paper-based, they'll have question booklets on paper, and you'll also have a bubble sheet or an answer sheet or a response sheet in which students are expected to color in the bubbles. So make sure you're doing practice with that style of testing as well. Can we put in any time for games and stuff? Yes, absolutely. So like I mentioned, it's very, very important to have a balanced timetable. It'd be very unfair for me to say, okay, you've got time from 3 o'clock till about, 9 o'clock every day. So you need to be studying continuously for 6 hours. If you do that, I guarantee you those 6 hours will not be productive. Your brain will not be functioning the way that it should be, on the day of the exam for those 6 hours. So it's very, very important to, take breaks, spend some time outdoors, do activities that get your heart racing, spend quality time with your family or pets or anything like that. Just make sure you stay balanced. But on average, you can see that, this particular timetable, gives students roughly about, 3 hours of study time spaced out and about 3 hours of, relaxation time. And it's very important to maintain that balance. Okay. All right. Now, another secret of high-performing students is that they're very, very familiar with the structure and format of the exam. So I've just got this slide here to make it a bit easier for you to have a look. The key thing is to understand the number of questions that are there for each paper and the amount of time that's there for each paper, right? Remember, high-performing students are very, very skilled at time management. And that includes both managing their time in terms of study, but also managing their time in the exam environment. Right. So for these students that also go on to do very well in the exam, they are the masters of their time, right? The clock doesn't control them, essentially. So, what are some things that we can do to, again, be more familiar with the concept of time management? The first thing is, have a very keen focus on timekeeping. Make sure that you can read an analog watch and clock as well. These days, I think most students are very familiar with reading digital time. It's the time that you find on iPads and devices and things like that. Not many students actually wear wristwatches and analog clocks anymore. But make sure that you actually can read an analog clock. Oftentimes in the actual selective test, what will happen is students do their exam in different places. Most students will do it at like their local high school. In some cases, they'll do it at their local primary school, or their own primary school, I should say. And sometimes you'll have like a separate testing venue. You don't know for sure what clock they're going to have in that venue. Most of the times there will be a digital clock on the wall. Sometimes they can have an analog clock on the wall as well. So just in case they have an analog clock, make sure that you can read that. A lot of students and parents ask, should we carry a wristwatch? Should we actually wear a watch when we go into the test? You can do that. Just make sure that the wristwatch is like a very simple watch. It can't be a smartwatch. It shouldn't connect to the internet, and it shouldn't make any noises. So, as long as it's like a silent like a silent wristwatch, that's fine. But remember that the main timekeeping piece for all the students will be whatever clock they have on the wall. So that's important because, some students are so used to just looking at their wrist that they forget to see what's up, on the wall, like the wall clock. And a lot of times you'll find that the times are not perfectly synced, right? So if you can make sure that the time is perfectly synced, then it's fine. But as a general rule, just make sure that you're familiar with reading the wall clock itself, okay? Another tip in terms of timekeeping is make sure that you use checkpoints, right? So a lot of students have come and asked me, thinking skills has 40 questions in 40 minutes. That means I should be spending 1 question per minute, right? Or, maths has 35 questions in 40 minutes. So that means I should be spending about 68.5 seconds per question. And to them, I always ask, how are you going to be sitting in that test and allocating 68 seconds per question? You're not going to be looking at the clock so carefully that you can map out 68 seconds, right? So it's actually much more efficient to instead divide the test into quarters. So for example, thinking skills has 40 questions. So a quarter of that's 10 questions. A quarter of the 40 minutes that you have is 10 minutes. So you have an average of 10 questions to be done in every 10 minutes. That means as soon as they say, your time starts now, you start on your thinking skills paper, you keep working through it, and you look up at the clock every now and then, right? You don't look at it, say, every 30 seconds or anything like that. You'll waste so much time just looking up and down. You might also, give yourself some neck pain doing that. So just look at the clock every now and then until you realize that 10 minutes have gone past, at which point you should have done 10 questions, okay? You need to catch up to the next checkpoint, which is 20 questions in 20 minutes. If you fall behind. So let's say you've only done, say, 5 questions in 10 minutes, then make sure that, you speed through the next 15 questions, focus on your strengths, the questions that you're good at. If they're questions that you're weaker at, you are allowed to take an educated guess if they're very time consuming. So, don't feel shy about doing that, and make sure that you catch up to the next checkpoint, 20 questions in 20 minutes. Because if you don't do that, you're going to keep falling behind and you're going to leave the last 10 questions blank. And remember that the test is in random order of difficulty. They don't put the hardest questions at the end. It's spread throughout the paper, right? It's all randomized. So you might actually end up with a fair few easy questions that you could have gotten correct if you had actually attempted them for the last 10 questions. Okay, so very important to be on top of these kinds of timekeeping strategies. Okay, just having another look at some questions. School weightage, reports, school marks, and things like that. I'll explain all the school-related things at the end. So if anyone has any questions on schools and just general advice, I'll make sure that I answer those questions at the end as well when you have the question and answer session. Will the selective exam be at random times or will it be at exact times like 9:30? So remember the selective exam, again, most of the times they tend to start at 9:30 on the dot. And then after that, it's a question of, how much break time and things that you'll get. It's usually rare for them to start the next paper at, say, 10:43 or, 11:37 and things like that. They don't usually do that because it's a bit confusing. But they can start with times rounded to the nearest 5. So make sure that if you had to start a, say, maths test at 10:35, you still know roughly how, where your checkpoints are. That's actually a really good question. And it brings me to another tip, which is, some of the students that do really well, when the exam begins, one thing they do is they just take a quick 10 seconds to write down their checkpoints, probably at the front of the booklet or at the back of the booklet or something like that. Remember, you are not allowed to write on the bubble sheet, right? The response sheet where you color in the A, B, C, D bubbles, do not write anything extra on that. Only color in your answer choices on that. Otherwise, the machine can get confused if you put in your maths working out or you start, drawing scribbles and things like that on it. But your question booklet, you can write as much as you want in your question booklet, okay? That's not going to get seen or marked by anyone. It's just the answer sheet that's going to get, marked by a machine in most cases. So that means that, as I was saying, what a lot of students do is, let's say your maths paper starts at 10:30 on the dot, right? So that the first checkpoint will be at 10:40. The next checkpoint is at 10:50. The next checkpoint is at 11 o'clock, and then 11:10 is the end of the exam. So they'll go ahead and write these checkpoints down, and next to it, they'll write down which question they should be up to. So again, I'll explain more of this, later on throughout the talk. But just another handy tip before I forget is you can write down these checkpoints in your question booklet, and you can actually write down anything that you need to refer back to in the question booklet. So don't be shy about that. Okay. Okay, so if you've been following that plan that we spoke about in the last section, which is, you commit to consistent practice, you undertake about 2 mock exams each week as a minimum, you spend the rest of your time during the week doing, drills and exercises to see improvement in each of the subjects. Like I said, you have like a balanced timetable so that you don't burn out and so that you, aren't tempted to procrastinate, then you're doing really well. You actually don't need to change a lot else in the 1 week before the exam, right? One thing I should say is mock exams are really good, right? And I mentioned why earlier on, but it's not a good idea to do complete, full selective test papers or selective style test papers, I should say, in the short lead up to the exam, right? So if you want to do like a mock exam the night before the test, or 2 nights before the exam, that's usually not a good idea. You're not going to get any advantages from doing mock exams that close to the actual test. And in fact, you might even end up stressing out yourself even more. If you do a mock exam, say the night before the exam, right night before the selective test, you get, say, unfortunately, you're not in the right mood to do it, you get half the questions wrong, then you're going to be very nervous on the day of the test. So don't do that. I would say a good guide is, remember, the test is on the 9th of May. Don't do any more practice papers after the 5th of May, right? So that weekend is the last weekend that you're doing practice papers. And then your Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday before the test, you're just doing light revision. Okay. Following routines, right? So in the final week before the selective exam, it's really all about routines. And that means routines with absolutely everything, right? Whether we're talking about things like studying, or even more mundane things like eating or sleeping, consistency is the key here, right? So first thing I want to say is healthy eating is really, really important, because a nutritious and balanced diet is sort of the main fuel for your brain. Just try and imagine that your brain is a fireplace, just like it's written there, right? You basically want that fire to burn continuously and burn in a nice, healthy way. So you sort of feed it like a steady stream of twigs and sticks and firewood. This is an analogy. I'm not saying, go and eat twigs and sticks and things like that. But just imagine if your brain was like a fireplace, you'd be feeding the fireplace a constant and consistent and, good supply of fuel. If you suddenly just dump some petrol in there, then that blaze is going to get out of control. It'll burn really big for a few seconds, and then it'll snuff out, right? It won't burn anymore. And that's exactly like what your brain would be like if you kept having junk food. Right? So if you start eating high amounts of sugar, then it's just like that analogy. You'll get this sudden burst of energy for a very short amount of time, and then you'll crash, and you won't have that sustained kind of energy. So make sure that you start cutting down on really, really sugary foods in the week before the exam, and you start following a healthy routine, especially in terms of your diet, right? Like a nice balanced diet, whatever staples your family's used to eating would be really good. Trust me, I know this stuff because part-time I'm a doctor as well. And on that note, I just want to say sometimes I get called into the hospital for overnight shifts, right? So most people work from, say, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Sometimes I have to start working at 9 p.m. and then stay awake until 8 a.m. the next day. If they just called me and they said, okay, come in straight away to the hospital, and I stayed awake the whole day, I'm awake from, say, 8 a.m. all the way until 9 p.m., and then I start to do my job and I'm expected to stay awake overnight, it just wouldn't work. I would crash. I would fall asleep by the time it hit midnight. So instead, what I usually do is I start spending some time, usually a couple of days before these night shifts, just getting my body clock adjusted, right? So, I might sleep for a few hours during the day, stay up awake a few hours, in the middle of the night and things like that, until I can comfortably sleep during the day and stay awake during the night, okay? I know that's an extreme example, but when it comes to your sleep routines before the selective test, it's the same concept, right? You need to give your body clock time to adjust. If you're used to, say, sleeping at midnight, and then you wake up at like 8:30, you just quickly change and then eat a quick snack bar, and then you rush out the door and get to school by, say, 8:45. It works for you on an average school day. You need to change that in the week before the exam, right? Remember, all sorts of crazy things can happen in the morning of the test, right? You might get stuck in traffic. There might be really bad weather. Maybe you feel a little bit sick, a bit more sick than you usually do. Touch wood. I really hope you don't feel any of these things, but it could happen. So you need to get into the habit of sleeping earlier and waking up a bit earlier than you normally do. And it usually takes you a full week to adjust to that. So the week before the selective exam, remember, like I said, you're going to fall into a healthy routine of eating and a healthy routine of sleeping earlier and waking up earlier than you normally do, right? It's very, very important that you give yourself at least 8 to 9 hours of sleep every night. And that's a sort of minimum, because that's what's needed to be fresh on the morning of the exam. Here's an example, right? There's a student, his name's Bob. He lives 30 minutes from school and he takes about 1 hour to get ready, right? He just, spend some time in the morning, just really relaxing and doing everything slowly. And he takes about 1 full hour to get ready. So what he's going to aim for is, if he normally sleeps really late, now he's going to start getting into the habit of going to bed at 9:30 p.m. every single night in the week before the exam, regardless of if it's a weekday or a weekend or anything like that. Okay. That means that if he was to doze off, after half an hour, say around 10 o'clock, then he still gets a comfortable 9 hours of sleep before waking up at 7 a.m., right? Wakes up at 7, he's ready to leave the house at 8. It only takes him half an hour to get to school. So he's there, well before 8:45, right? Remember, on the day of the exam, you have to get there by 8:45 and, account for things happening unexpectedly, and just be prepared for something to slow you down on the morning of the exam, and you don't want to go through that kind of stress. So, make sure we set these sleep routines as well. Bedtime routine. So, I really want to spend some time talking about this, because every year I hear students that, call me up after the test and they say, oh, I was really, really nervous in the night before the exam. I just couldn't sleep properly. There was a lot of things on my mind. And then when I woke up on the morning of the test and I got only like a couple of hours of sleep, I wasn't very functional, and just the test didn't go that well, right? This happens every single year. So how can we avoid that? Well, remember, it's really, really important to have some sort of bedtime routine and stick with the same routine every day. Again, this is really, really important in that 1 week before the test, right? A lot of these students that kind of get nervous before the exam and didn't sleep properly, usually what they actually end up doing is they disrupt their bedtime routine somehow, right? Suddenly they have this realization, oh no, it's the night before the selective exam. So what are they going to do? They're going to start, revising maths concepts from 9:30 to 10, right? Or it's 8 o'clock, they get really nervous the night before the test, so they start looking through all of their STTC scores, right? Even worse than that, they do a practice test and they don't do very well in that practice test, okay? Don't do anything like that. Find your routine and stick to that routine, and do that routine especially strictly the night before the exam. So what happens is, again, everyone has some sort of bedtime routine, and you can sort of decide what works best for you. Some students, they'll go to bed at 9:30, they'll read a book for about 20 minutes, and then they'll just doze off after that, right? Some students, they can't sleep until they've had a good chance to talk about their day, or talk about the news, or talk about something. So they just talk to their siblings or talk to their parents or family members, and then they doze off, right? That's their routine. Some other students, they find that the day's been pretty crazy. They've done a lot of practice papers and drills and exercises, and their mind is sort of buzzing. So what they do is they just listen to some calming music just to quieten down their minds, and then they fall asleep, right? It doesn't matter what sort of routine you have. You decide what works best for you, but make sure you stick with that routine. And most importantly, please avoid using any electronic devices, at least for a minimum of 1 hour before you go to bed. So when I say, read for 20 minutes, try not to read on an iPad, try not to, play Minecraft or Roblox, or, jump on video games for that 1 hour before sleeping, because your mind will sort of keep, buzzing, and it's not good for your ability to fall asleep, right? Another thing to avoid is caffeine. I don't know many kids that are in the routine of drinking coffee or energy drinks or even tea or anything like that. If you do have that habit, just make sure that you don't drink caffeine after, say, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. You need to be able to fall asleep naturally, and then have a nice, peaceful, well-rested night of sleep. Okay. The night before the exam. So just before we get into the next section, I'm just going to have another quick look at the questions over here. When will we know the exam location? Okay, so later on in April, roughly about 2 weeks before the day of the exam, about 2 weeks before the 9th of May, you will have a test authority letter that becomes available. So if you go online to your application portal, they'll have the test authority letter there, and that will tell you the venue of your test. So they will tell you, where the test is in that authority letter. What other questions do we have? So there's a few questions on which schools to choose, or the cutoffs or minimum entry scores for certain schools and things like that. So if you still have those questions, I'll try and clear those up at the end, because again, they're bigger questions that take a bit more time to answer. Other students asking about, what if I can't fall asleep? Honestly, it's very common. Like I said, it's you've been practicing for this test for at least a year in many cases. A lot of students tend to be very nervous the night before the selective test. So the tool that you have to combat that nervousness, to fight off these nerves, is sticking to your routines. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, find a bedtime routine that works for you and stick to that and follow that exact same routine the night before the selective test. If you find that you normally read for 20 minutes and it's the night before the exam and you're super nervous and you just, it's not doing it for you, read for a bit longer, read for about 30 minutes, okay? But don't do anything drastically different from this routine, okay? How do I calm my nerves during the paper? We'll go through some things related to the paper itself later on in today's session. And, how do you get to the test authority sheet? So the authority letter gets released on your online application portal. So whichever portal you used to, on the Department of Education's website to log in, put down your school preferences, put down your details and things like that. That's where the form gets released. Have a quick look at the night before the test. So, I mentioned that you want to have a good nighttime routine just before the test. Another thing that you should do is make sure that you pack your bag the night before. Don't do it on the morning of the exam because this also boosts confidence. On the day of the test, you're going to be nervous. You're going to have a lot of things going on. Packing your bag is one less thing to worry about if you've done it the night before. So what do you need to take? Again, you can find all this information on the Department of Education's website. You can always go back to this talk as well. It's recorded and it will be put on our YouTube channel. The main things that they recommend you pack are two 2B pencils. 2 is good. Don't just stick with 1 in case the pencil lead breaks on one of them and you don't want to waste time sharpening and things like that. Just stick with, 1 main pencil and a backup. Make sure you take your own eraser and you take your own sharpener. If you find that you want to rub out an answer on the day of the test, you don't have a rubber, you're going to be wasting time asking the invigilator, what you need to do. So just, be prepared and take your own supplies. Generally, you want to pack these in a plastic sleeve, like a display folder sleeve or like a clear pencil case. If it's a solid pencil case, one that you can't see through, then it's not allowed. So it has to be something where they can see exactly the contents of the sleeve or the contents of the pencil case. So make sure you have all of your stationery in that. A clear plastic water bottle. Again, you're not allowed to take metal water bottles or anything that you can't see through, so make sure it's clear. The test authority letter, make sure you print that out in advance and you take that with you on the day of the exam. You need to have that with you. And like I said, it's available on the application portal on the Department of Education's website. So make sure you take that with you. Remember, you do get a decently long lunch break between your maths and thinking skills papers. So make sure that you have a nice, well-balanced, nutritious, and easy to eat lunch that you take on the day of the exam. If it's like a really messy lunch, again, you're going to, it's just, more things to worry about on the day of the test. You might be worried about spilling it. You might be worried about how to eat it and things like that. So stick with like a healthy sandwich or something that's relatively easy and quick to eat, and make sure it's nutritious. It's not a good idea to, pack, say, like a full pack of jelly beans or like, some instant coffee or something like that because you hope it'll give you an energy boost. Any quick energy boost you get will also give you a quick crash. So make sure you stick with nutritious things that give you sustained energy over a period of time. Most students, I think pretty much all public school students will need to wear their school uniform. So make sure you have that, laid out and ready to go so that you're not wasting time trying to find it in the morning. And if you are going to take a watch, make sure that it's a silent wristwatch. Make sure it is not a smartwatch. It doesn't look anything like an Apple Watch. It can't be mistaken for like a smartwatch or anything like that because it won't be allowed. Okay, and remember, you want to follow your bedtime routine as strictly as possible. Any other questions? Let's have a look. Some students are asking if we can bring 8B or 6B or 4B pencils and things like that. So yes, if you use a very light pencil, then it's going to be harder to read. If you use a really thick and heavy and dark pencil, well, it's going to be kind of hard to rub that out. Again, you don't want to be wasting time in the exam trying to rub out like pencil markings and things like that. So I would stick with the 2B pencil because that's the one that the actual Department of Education recommends. Another question: are you allowed to talk to other students during the break? Look, I'll explain that when we talk about what happens on the day of the test itself. Another student asking, is a sandwich a good idea? yes, I would say a sandwich is a pretty good idea, right? Fairly nutritious. Oh, it depends on the filling, of course. If you if you take like a sandwich with hundreds and thousands and have some like jam in there and just like pack it with sugar, that might not be the best idea if you're not used to that. So a nice healthy sandwich would be really good. Is a Fitbit okay? No, I wouldn't recommend a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or anything that could be mistaken for a smart device, anything that can connect to the internet. Just stick with a simple watch. If it has to be a digital watch, just make sure it doesn't have like a calculator function or anything like that, which is one of the main reasons I recommend an analog watch, because it can't be mistaken for anything else. But yeah, stick with a simple watch if you're going to take one. And if you are going to take one, just remember the main timekeeping device for the day of the test is the wall clock. And that's what you should be relying on during the exam. Okay. Can we take mechanical pencils? Again, I would not recommend anything other than a 2B pencil. Mechanical pencils take a long time, like a pacer, takes a long time. If the lead breaks off, it might not shade dark enough. You might have to keep reloading it with those refills and things. I'd try and stick to a pencil as much as possible. Okay. Is a digital watch or a stopwatch okay? Again, make sure it's as simple as possible. Don't use anything that looks like a smart device. Will they confiscate your watch? You won't be allowed to take it in the first place. All right, let's move on. I know there's lots of different questions, and I'll try my best to get through them as much as possible. What happens on the morning of the test itself? So what I'm going to try and do is just walk you through the next few hours on the 9th of May, which is the date of your selective test. On the day of the exam, right, it is a big day ahead. Make sure you start this big, important day with a nutritious and balanced breakfast, right? Again, try and stick with routines. Whatever you normally have for breakfast would be the best breakfast to have on the day of the test. If you normally have, I don't know, like Wheat Bix in the morning, and that's a good breakfast, it's nutritious and balanced and, healthy, then don't change it around. Don't suddenly, just have plain Cocoa Pops for breakfast, because again, you're going to get that energy spike. It's a lot of sugar to be having in one go. Just stick with whatever you're used to and make sure it's nutritious and well balanced, right? Make sure that your bag is already packed. Again, you should have done this the night before. That checklist on the previous slide, you can always go back and have a look at that in the night before the exam and tick that off. Or you can find all of this information on the Department of Education's website. Aim to be at the center before 8:45 in the morning, right? So that's the official guideline. You do not want to be late. It will just stress you out and make you nervous. Also be prepared for unexpected things happening on the day of the exam, like traffic jams and strange weather conditions and things like that. So account for that and give yourself more time than you need, essentially. If you're used to leaving home at 8:30, try and leave home at 8 o'clock or 8:15, just to have that buffer time. In terms of water, so make sure that you try and have small sips of water from 8 a.m. onwards. No one wants to be drinking a large amount of water at, say, 8:30, and then you're going into the exam hall at 9 o'clock. You start your reading test at 9:30, and you suddenly find that you really have to go to the bathroom, right? You do not want to be in that position where you're missing out on valuable time. So make sure you take a bathroom break, before the test starts, or during the designated break times, and just stick with small sips of water, because it's important to stay hydrated. Once you've arrived at the exam hall, so from 8:45 to 9 o'clock onwards, all the students will be gathered and then taken into the exam hall, right? Make sure you stay focused during this time. Any instructions that are given to you, make sure that you follow these instructions. If there's anything that doesn't make sense to you or anything that seems out of the ordinary, and this happens to children every single year, make sure you actually ask questions, all right? Don't be shy. I'll give you some examples of things that have happened before. Once there was a student who was sitting in the selective exam, and they had, again, most schools, they usually have these collapsible tables, right? These tables that they're flat, and then you pop up the legs and it stands up, and then you have a sturdy table to use. One student sat down on one of these tables, and he noticed that the table was shaking a lot, right? Like when he would just write his name at the top of the booklet, or like color in certain bubbles and things like that, the table was constantly shaking, right? Now it was shaking way more than usual, right? So he was really scared that it might collapse and fall during the test, but he didn't say anything, didn't ask any questions. One of the legs of the chairs actually seemed really weak, didn't say a word. Reading test starts, 10 minutes into the exam, as he's rubbing out one of the answers, the table just like breaks, collapses, and falls, right? And obviously this is a very off-putting thing. It took him about 10 minutes to be able to, get the invigilator's attention, have them, prop up the table. By now his heart's like racing. By the time he, calmed himself down and actually went ahead with the rest of the reading paper, it took about 10 minutes of his time and made him really, really nervous and kind of, made him lose his flow, right? That could have been avoided if you just, asked the invigilator, about the table being really shaky, right? Maybe that's an extreme example. Another one is that there was a student that, walked into the exam hall and realized that there was no wall clock, right? The student didn't take a watch on the day and they found that there was no clock for them to use. That makes the test really, really hard. You're not expected to do the test without a clock. So if you can't find one, just make sure that you ask them, you say, hey, I can't see a clock. I really need one for, the exam. Like, is there a clock that we can use? Or can I use my wristwatch in this case, right? So anything that seems a bit off to you, anything that you're a bit confused about, just put up your hands and ask. If you are confused, there's a good chance that other students are confused as well. So don't be shy about asking questions, okay? Now I'm going to give you something that might be a bit unusual. It's a walkthrough of the test, right? One of the strategies that high-performing students use, right, the children that do really, really well in the test, is that they're able to visualize exactly how the day will unfold, right? That way, they don't leave things up to chance. So they don't just, get to the exam hall and then just take everything as it comes, just passively watching what happens. They're actually able to, visualize in the head, okay, I know that the test starts at this time. I know that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on this, this, and this. I know that I'm constantly making mistakes with maths because I don't read the units carefully. So I'm going to make sure that when the maths test starts, I underline those units and things like that. They're able to kind of lay out in their head what each and every section will require from them and will happen on the day of the test. So make sure that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through what I call a walkthrough of the exam, where we collectively together, we can also visualize how the day will unfold, okay? Before we get to that, I'm just going to have another quick at the questions to see if there's anything that I haven't answered. One student is asking, if you are late, do they give you extra time? No, they don't, right? Make sure that you're not late because it can come with different consequences. On the worst case scenario, they won't let you sit the test at all. Otherwise, they might let you into the exam hall late, but you don't get extra time or anything like that. So no matter what happens, make sure that you get to the exam hall by 8:45. Okay. Will extra time be provided? No. So like I said, no extra time will be provided. What if you are in a private school? So this will really depend. As a general rule, you should wear school uniform because that's the only accepted, thing that you need to wear. In the authority letter, it specifically says you need to wear your school uniform. In terms of where your test will be, just wait for that authority letter to come out. Even if you're in a public school, make sure that you look at the test authority letter because, you might not be in the same exam hall that's expected and students get allocated, depending on how many students can fit into each hall. So make sure you have a look at the test authority letter, right? If a table collapses, do they get extra time? Again, they don't really give you extra time for anything. Depending on the circumstances, you might be able to apply for like special considerations. We've had situations where students have been really, really sick on the day of the exam. Again, I have a friend of mine who, like I said, I've done lots of exams in my time, right? Like really high pressure exams for medical schools and things like that. I had a close friend of mine who, he would like literally avoid other people that were sick so that he wouldn't fall sick himself. I know that sounds pretty extreme, but just make sure that you do healthy things and that you avoid falling sick before the test. If you do happen to fall sick on the day of the exam, then there are these additional things like special considerations and all that. But generally speaking, they're not going to give you more time on the day of the test. Okay, so just make sure that you follow all these tips and tricks rigorously when you're in the lead up to the test. Okay, will they tell you when there's 5 minutes or 1 minute left? No, they won't, right? There's a clock that goes up. It's up to you to, actually undertake, it's up to you to follow the timekeeping device carefully. They don't tell you when there's 5 minutes left or 1 minute left and things like that. So just make sure you keep an eye on the clock, you follow the checkpoints, and you are well prepared, for when the test finishes. The worst thing that can happen is you finish 3/4 of the paper, and they say time up, pencils down, right? And you've left 10 questions blank. Remember, you do not want to leave any questions blank. If you take a blind guess, you still have a chance of getting that question correct. If you leave it blank, you have a 100% chance of getting it wrong. So don't leave any questions blank. Okay, and make sure that you allocate at least 1 minute at the very end just to go ahead and color any bubbles if you've run out of time. All right, let's talk about what's going to happen on the day of the test itself for each and every subject. So your first paper is your reading test. Okay, your reading test for the past few years typically has 4 passages that you need to do in 40 minutes, right? That usually means one passage will take you about 10 minutes. The first 2 passages, or the first 2 texts that they have, are usually poems and narratives, right? So there'll be one short story extract or 2 stories combined, and then that's your first text type, and your second text type is typically a poem, okay? Then your next 2 text types are typically a closed passage and a linked extract. So they give you, for the linked extracts, they give you about 10 questions, which describe different features of these 4 paragraphs that all follow the same theme. Definitely have a look at the the mock exams that I recommended towards the beginning of the video to have a look and familiarize yourself with these text types. Closed passages, of course, it's a big text where they have certain sentences missing and you need to figure out where the missing sentences go. But yeah, for most years, this is the structure of the reading test, okay? Extracts usually have about 10 questions. So typically question 21 to question 30 are from that linked extract, and the remaining 21 questions are split between your narratives, your poems, and your closed passages. Okay, now the reading test is not the easiest paper, but remember that it's definitely the most relaxed paper out of all of them from a timing perspective, right? Like I said, you have about 4 passages to be done in about 40 minutes. And most students find that they actually have the luxury of time in this exam. So the focus is all about how well you understand these texts. So one tip is make sure that you're able to summarize what you read. Right? This is really critical. As you're reading through it, you should have a mental summary of, what's happening in the text, what are the key events, the key ideas, the themes, who are the main characters, what are they doing, what are the key emotions that they're likely to be feeling. If you're struggling to keep it in your head, make sure that you annotate these things or you write it down, say in the margins or just next to the text itself. Remember, you can't write anything in the answer sheet other than the answers. You have to color in the bubbles and that's all you do there. But in the question booklet, you can write whatever you like. So make sure you actually, take advantage of that. Sometimes it can be very simple. You can just underline certain quotes and underline certain key phrases. If you want to know what I mean, have a look at our YouTube channel. We've covered this concept in depth in our past paper reviews on YouTube. So, have a look at the 2023 or the 2021 past papers on the Alpha One YouTube channel. And you can actually see what I mean by going ahead and annotating, key ideas, key events and things like that, right? A lot of students find it's very easy in this time before the exam. Sometimes, you just don't feel like undertaking a full reading test, right? Let's say next week, all you've been doing is reading and you're really sick of it and you don't want to be doing a reading paper on one particular evening. That's okay. Just jump on YouTube and watch this video and see if you can learn from the strategies that our tutors use. It's a lot more relaxed to actually watch these videos, and you'll also learn some things that you might not have realized before. So, have a look at those videos and make sure that you follow those systems of annotating what you read and, highlighting key information. That's the reading paper. Remember, the reading test is 40 minutes. Then you typically get like a 10-minute break because it usually takes that time at least for the invigilators to go ahead and collect all the reading papers and then hand out all the maths papers and then give you enough time to, fill in your name and other details in the bubble sheet. This 10-minute time is a reset window, okay? What I mean by that is you don't want to be thinking about anything remotely related to reading in that 10-minute break after the reading paper. At this point, the reading paper is ancient history, right? It's gone, it's done and dusted, right? You shouldn't be thinking about that at all. I don't want you to be thinking thoughts like, oh, the closed passage was really hard. Oh, I didn't understand anything in, the poem. Oh man, like I think I missed out on the last couple of questions in the extract. These are not thoughts that you should be having. Forget about the reading paper. Like I said, it's ancient history. All you should be thinking about in the 10 minutes before the maths exam begins is the ways that you normally mess up with maths, right? Think about all the mistakes that you usually make with maths and actively review in your head how you can avoid making those mistakes in the maths paper that's coming up, right? One thing that, again, a lot of high-performing students do is they have a separate notebook and they call it their book of mistakes. And every time they make some sort of mistake in like a maths paper, maybe they said 20 plus 10 equals 40, right? And that was a mistake that they made in one exam. Another mistake was the question was asking, how many mils was in the jar, and this person gave their answer in liters. They picked the answer that had liters instead of milliliters, right? Anytime they make these kinds of mistakes, or maybe one day they forgot the formula for how to find the area of a rectangle or a triangle, any of these kinds of mistakes, they go into their book and they write it down. And every couple of weeks they go back and they revise this book and look through what mistakes they've made, and they read that again. And trust me, it's not as depressing as it sounds, right? You might think, oh man, I don't want to be reminded of all the mistakes that I've done before, but it's actually a good thing, because remember, every mistake that you make before the test is one less mistake that you need to make on the day of the test. So if you go back and periodically revise these mistakes, on the day of the exam, you can do the same thing, revise these mistakes that you've made. That way you know what to avoid in the upcoming exam, okay? So that's what you should be doing in the reset time between the reading and the maths test, right? Remember your mistakes and remember how to avoid those mistakes. The maths test. Now, remember, this exam is called mathematical reasoning, right? And that means that the answer choices usually ask you to use an extra layer of logic rather than just putting numbers into simple formulas, right? Which basically means that you need to pay attention to a lot of key things like units of measurement, or the scales and labels on tables, or specific parts of a graph, right? A lot of students lose very valuable marks towards silly mistakes because they simply didn't read what the question was asking for. So the question might say, which of the following is not correct, or which of the following is true, or have some sort of variation of the answers that you need to get from a certain graph or table. Make sure that you read exactly what the question is asking for very carefully, right? Sometimes the question might say, which fraction was shaded gray? And you don't want to be reading which fraction was shaded black. Or it might say, how many lollies were in the bag at the end? And you don't want to be reading how many lollies were at the start. So any of these keywords that come up, make sure you underline them or circle them. You're kind of spoon feeding your brain so that you're not like skipping through important details. So make sure that you underline or circle key informations and pay very, very careful attention to details. The maths test, I'll give you again a few insider secrets, has actually been getting slightly easier and easier every year for the past 10 years, right? 10 years ago, students had to learn, more complex amounts of maths theory. These days, the amount of theory that you have to know is taught as part of the school curriculum, right? Which means that a lot of students are going to do very well in the maths test if they can just learn to be careful, okay? That also means that every one mistake you make in the maths paper is going to lead to a big drop in your rankings because all the other students are doing so well. So you don't want to be losing valuable marks, right? Make sure that you pay careful and close attention to details. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick break and have a look through any questions that students have put up. Can you highlight important parts and bring a highlighter? No, I would not bring a highlighter to the test. If you need to highlight things, just use your pencil and underline or circle key information. Can I put up the 5 senses book up again? Yep, I'll mention that again towards the end of the session. Or remember, this is a recorded session, so you can always rewind to the front of the video and have a look at those books, but I'll put those up towards the end again. Should I start from the test? Should I start the test from the back? Okay, this is a really interesting question. So some students, instead of working from question 1 to 35 or 1 to 40, they go from back to front. So they start at question 40, then 39, then 38, and so on. Personally, I don't recommend that method because sometimes you'll have a few questions all related to the same stem. So it might be like, it gives you a paragraph of information, and then question 37, 38, 39 all relate to that information, which means that you're going to get a bit disjointed when you do the questions, right? Like, what's the order? You do 40, then 39, then you do 37, and then 38, right? It's very confusing. The other thing is when you do things like that, right? Remember, your brain is used to counting numbers forward. It's not used to counting numbers backwards. So when you do it backwards, there's a high chance that you might actually skip a bubble and go on to the next bubble where you've accidentally colored in the wrong bubble. What do I mean by that? And this actually happens more often than you'd think. So you plan on coloring the bubbles for questions 8, 9, and 10, and you do that fine. Then instead of coloring the bubble for question 11, you color it in under question 12, which means question 12 is wrong because you've put in the answer for question 11 and you've left that one blank. And then question 13 is going to be wrong because you've put in question 12's answer. Question 14 is going to be wrong because you've put in question 13's answer, and so on until you end up getting most of the paper wrong. So you do not want to open yourself up to those kinds of risks. Cleanest and easiest way is just to go from the beginning of the test to the end of the test and follow it in order. Is the maths paper at Alpha 1 STTC similar to the real exam? Yes, I would say so. All of our exam papers are written after studying the types of questions that come up in the exam. So the difficulty for all the Alpha 1 tests are very, very similar to the difficulty of the selective exam as well. And likewise for the other resources that I put up at the beginning. So the 5 census textbooks are also, in my opinion, a close match to the standards of the actual test. And obviously same with the Department of Education's website, because that is the actual test. They put up the actual test that has appeared in previous years on their website. Okay. Let me just have another look at any other questions. How do I manage my time for the maths test as I get carried away doing a single question? So with this one, it might be easier if we talk through the thinking skills test first, because thinking skills is the hardest to manage the time conditions for. If you can do that well, then you should be okay with the maths test as well. All right, so where are we up to now? We've done the reading paper, we've taken a break, now we've done the maths paper as well. Good job. You're doing a really, it's really good effort. You've worked extremely hard and you've reached the halfway point. The reward for that is you get a dedicated 30-minute lunch break, right? During the lunch break, it's very, very tempting to, go up to all the other students, discuss what happened in the maths paper. You are allowed to talk to students outside of the exam hall. During the exam, no one should be talking at all. Don't be muttering things under your breath. Don't ask your neighbor. Definitely don't ask your neighbor, what they put the question for. There's just no talking. It's, pin drop silence. It's actual test conditions. You do not need to be talking to anyone else, and you shouldn't be talking to anyone else. But during the break time after the math test is done, typically you leave the exam hall, and that's your 30-minute break to actually eat your lunch. In my opinion, I would recommend, if you want to talk to your friends, talk about something neutral, like what your plans are after the selective exam, what rewards your parents are going to get you for working so hard for the selective test, what things you've been asking your family to give you for getting into a particular school. You might want to talk about what schools you're thinking of. You might want to talk about any sort of movies or just something neutral, right? I would seriously avoid talking about any of the papers that you've done, like the reading paper and the maths paper, because firstly, it's unfair to yourself. Like, if someone says, oh, question 30 to 40 was really easy, I got them all correct, but you actually struggled with that, then it's going to make you nervous, right? If someone said the answer to question 30 is C and you actually put B, again, that's going to make you nervous, and you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about that in your head. So, you don't want to psych yourself out in that way. So just try and avoid talking about the test. If everyone is, sitting there dissecting the exam and talking about every nitty-gritty detail from the reading paper and the maths paper, and they just refuse to, change the topic, then it might actually be helpful to kind of step away from the group for a bit, focus on eating your lunch. Use a very similar tactic to what you did in the break between reading and maths, right? So in the break before the reading and maths paper, remember what you actually did was you revised the kinds of mistakes you usually make with maths, and you revised how to avoid making those mistakes. Do that same thing, and that's how you should be spending your break time, okay? Then comes the thinking skills test. All right. So just remember, again, during the break time, eat your lunch, use the bathrooms. Thinking skills is the most intense test for time, and try your best to revise the strategies for thinking skills. And then you walk into the exam and the thinking skills paper begins, right? Thinking skills is a really tricky subject, as you know, right? I would say for most students, it's the hardest paper out of all 4 of them. For the majority of students, it's definitely the hardest paper to do in time, right? 40 questions to be done in 40 minutes is very, very intense, okay? And a lot of the questions have fairly big questions, stems. There's a lot to read, short paragraphs to read. So the key to remember is, the key to acing this test is to remember that it rewards speed and focus, okay? A lot of the students get sort of tired out after doing, say, 20 questions. So you need to make sure that you can pace your attention. And a lot of the students spend a lot of time on the first, say, 10 to 20 questions, and they fall very behind. So remember, just like I was saying before, don't think of the test as 1 question per minute, right? Just like you don't think of the maths test as 68 seconds per question. Think of it in terms of checkpoints. So you want to allocate 10 questions for 10 minutes, right? If you find yourself falling behind the first checkpoint, so you've only done 7 or 8 questions in 10 minutes, then you need to make sure that you speed up. So you do the next 13 questions in the next 10 minutes. And yes, that will mean, it will mean skipping out on a couple of questions here and there. It might mean eliminating 2 answer choices and taking a guess between 2 of the answer choices. It might mean that there are some questions that you just don't have the time to work out, or you don't have the time to read each and every detail. Sometimes you might have to skim through certain paragraphs here and there. It's okay, but you need to know which questions you can do that for. And that's why, remember I said it's very useful to do mock exams and to reflect on the mistakes that you've made. If you know that there's a certain question type that you always make mistakes in, or you know that it's always something that takes a lot of time for you to read through and get through, then those are the ones that you want to be spending less time on the day of the exam. Remember, everyone talks about how you should be working on your weaknesses before the test, and that's true. What they don't talk about is how you should be playing to your strengths on the day of the exam. So if you know that you're very strong with your mathematical problem solving questions and your logical reasoning questions, but the argument questions you really struggle with and you're very slow at doing them, then as you're rushing to do 13 questions in 10 minutes, you might want to say that the argument questions are the ones that you're going to spend less than a minute on, okay? That way you've caught up to the next checkpoint, which is 20 questions in 20 minutes, and you're giving yourself a fair attempt at each and every question, okay? Just like with maths, make sure that you pay attention to the nitty-gritty details, so the scales and the labels on tables, interpret graphs very carefully, and especially with thinking skills, make sure that you underline or circle exactly what the question's asking for. A lot of these thinking skills questions, say which of the following is true, which of the following is not true, which of the following statements strengthens the argument, or which of the following weakens the argument, okay? So make sure you circle or underline those keywords: strengthening, weakening, true, not true, like Delilah, like it might say, how many horses did Delilah own, as opposed to circling how many horses that Bob owned. So, focus on the details in the question, and make sure you spoon feed your brain, highlight or circle or underline these things, so that, you give yourself the best chance of recognizing them in the test. Okay. Now you get a 10-minute break before the writing test. Is this starting to sound familiar? Because it should, right? This is how I know that you've practiced enough before the exam, and all of your break times and all of your routines and things like that. Remember, in the 10-minute break time between the thinking skills and the writing test, you are not thinking about the thinking skills test, right? You're not, going over and mulling over which question you got wrong, or which question you were nervous with, or, some silly mistake that you made. Don't think about those things. It's ancient history. It's in the past. Your only focus should be on writing, okay? Now, the writing section is a bit of a mystery, right? Because you don't know which text type or prompt you'll get, and it varies, every year. You could get any text type at all. So just some examples. You might, if you're planning on doing the actual test papers from like the Department of Education's website, you might want to like cover your ears for a bit, or not focus on what I'm going to say too much. I'm just going to give you some examples of exact writing prompts that came up in previous years, right? So try and avoid spoilers if you can. First, last year what they had was they asked the students to write an email to a company to come up with a comic book character, or to come up with a superhero, right? So your task was to basically imagine some new superhero, and then write an email to this company and then just describe your superhero, right? So what things can they do, what do they look like, and things like that. In years before that, one year what they asked the students to do is to write a news report, and the news report basically covers this event that happened at the beach, right? So it was a very chaotic day at the beach. There was a shipping container that had all these party supplies and things like, party hats and balloons and paper plates and decorations. And the shipping container basically spilt all its contents onto the beach. So when the residents woke up and they looked at the beach, it was filled with all of these random supplies. And you need to write a news report about what happened that day. Make sure that you interview witnesses or interview authorities, and you have quotes from people. And the text type is a news report, right? So you can see these two text types are very different. They could ask you to write a short story, like a narrative or a fiction piece. They could ask you to write a persuasive piece where you have to convince the other guy or the other side about one thing. They could ask you to write a discussion where you have to weigh up both sides. They could ask you to write a review, like a review of your favorite book, or a review of a new movie that you saw, or a review of your favorite tech product, like a new phone that's been released. They could ask you to write it in different formats, like it could be a diary entry or a journal or a letter, or it could be an email. They could ask you to write a speech, right? So it's a bit different to a persuasive. Yes, you're trying to persuade an audience rather than one person. And there are certain techniques that are specific to speeches. So they really could, ask you to write all these different text types. Make sure that before, in the next couple of weeks, you have a list of the different text types that they could ask. And you just, keep revising some of the key features of these text types, okay? So like I said, on the day of the exam, the writing section is a mystery. You don't know which text type they'll give you. You don't know which prompt they'll give you. So give yourself the best chance of success and make sure you're familiar with the variety of different text types they can have. Okay. The writing section is all about your ability to plan, to think on the spot and come up with creative and unique ideas, to actively use your personal voice and use the skills that you've worked so hard to acquire, because your main goal for writing is to differentiate yourself from the other 17,000 students that are sitting the exam. Okay, that's right. There's more than 17,000 other kids that are going to be writing the selective test for this year. And for things like thinking skills or for reading or maths, they're multiple choice tests, right? There's no way that they're looking at, how unique you are as a person, because, everyone's filling in the same A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, etc. Writing is the one paper that you have to actually, demonstrate your uniqueness to the marker, to demonstrate, your personal skills and your personal style of writing, again, to set yourself apart from the other 17,000 kids that are writing the paper, right? So here are some tips that might be helpful. The first thing is, when the invigilator says, you may begin, or your time starts now, please don't immediately, pick up your pencil, put it to the line paper and start writing your introduction, okay? Do not do that. Why do I say that? Because the selective exam used to give children 20 minutes to fill out 2 A4 pieces of paper, right? Your time limit was 20 minutes and the limit was 2 A4 pieces of paper. In recent years, they've increased the time. So they give you 30 minutes now. So in your exam, you can expect 30 minutes for the writing section, but they only still expect you to fill out 2 A4 pieces of paper. In other words, you have more time, and they understand that it's realistic to fill out 2 A4 pieces of paper in about 20 to 25 minutes. The additional time that you have, you should really spend on planning out your response, okay? So when they say your time starts now, right, usually what happens is they give the prompt and then they have some blank space underneath the prompt, and then they give you 2 lined A4 pieces of paper after that, right? So in that blank space that you have, you can use that space to just, draw some scribbles and, write out a plan, write some dot points and things like that. Even before that, what you need to do is firstly underline the text type. Every year we have, I've heard of students that when they ask you to write a story, they write a persuasive, or when they ask you to write a news report, they write a speech. And that is going to be disastrous to your marks because you haven't answered the question. You need to give them the text type that they ask for. So make sure you firstly underline the text type. Then you're starting to make some scribbles, like circle the following features. And those features are, number one is see if you can write down who the main audience is. So if you're writing a news report addressed to just, the general public, then the general public is your audience, right? And with that comes a certain style of writing. If you are writing a speech to your fellow classmates, again, the audience is your fellow classmates, all the other children in your grade. Your style of writing and the language that you use is going to be tailored towards them, right? If instead you are writing a letter to the Prince of England, that is also going to take a very formal approach, right? Your writing piece needs to be very formal in its language. So make sure that, firstly, you underline the text type. Secondly, you identify who the audience is. That will help you figure out how formal your writing piece needs to be. And it also helps you figure out the modality of the text. In other words, how convincing do you need to be? Are you actively trying to convince someone? Are you trying to give both sides of the argument, juggle all the evidence, for or against, or I should say for and against? Identifying these key features are really, really important. Then your next job is to figure out the purpose, right? What exactly are you trying to achieve through this writing piece? And that will help you structure your paragraphs. You can write a plan for your paragraphs in many different ways, okay? One way that a lot of students do it is they write, one topic sentence for their 3 body paragraphs. So let's say you're going to write a review of the latest iPhone, okay? So they'll just write a quick sentence, which is the topic sentence of each of their body paragraphs. So it might be, in your review, the first paragraph is going to focus on the design. So they write, just one sentence about the design of the iPhone. Like, it has lots of different colors. It's made of titanium. It's very durable. It's quite sleek and fairly light. All those features basically come under the concept of design. So they write one blanket statement about the design of the iPhone, okay? Their second paragraph is going to focus on the software and the new features that it has. So they're going to write another sentence on that. And then the third paragraph might be, something to do with all the different accessories that you can have for the phone. So that's going to be their third sentence, right? Underneath each of these sentences, they have 3 bullet points. And those bullet points might be, remember, like I said, for the design, it could be the material that's used. It could be the aesthetics and the color, and it could be something like the sleekness of it, right? So these are the elements that go into that body paragraph. So ultimately, the plan looks like 3 sentences with 3 dot points for each sentence. Okay, and that's a plan. Or if that takes you too long and you're not a very fast writer, you might want to use a tree diagram. So what they'll do is they'll write down iPhone. They'll have 3 branches coming off the iPhone and just write, again, what the 3 body paragraphs are going to focus on. And then they'll have 3 more branches coming off each of these. And those, tiny branches are going to have, the more specific dot points, right? Regardless of how you want to set out your plan, again, if let's say you're doing a short story, like a narrative, a really good way of planning that out is to have like a flow chart. So, you draw one box and in that you write the first event, then you have an arrow going to the second box, you write down the next event, and then you have another arrow going to the third box and you write down the final set of events that takes place. So, that's another way of planning out this like creative response, okay? So regardless of what works best for you, just make sure that you stick with planning out your response before you go ahead and write. Remember, the test rewards students that showcase their unique ideas in their individual voice for a text that's broad in that it can cover all these different aspects of the piece, but it also contains plenty of detail for each of these pieces, okay? And with that, right, it basically concludes the exam for that day. That's sort of the culmination of all your efforts. And I guarantee you, by the time you walk out of that exam hall, let's say 1:30 p.m., like 1:30 in the afternoon, you'll be exhausted, and you'll also have the best sleep of your night, knowing that no one's going to be bothering you with exam preparation the day after that, right? Or at least for the next few months. The weekends are also going to be stress-free, so you have that to look forward to. But in summary, that's just a walkthrough of how the exam itself will run. Remember, you have 6 weeks to go until that date, so now is the time to make the most of your preparation time. We're just going to get into our question and answer session. So, like I said, that covers everything that I want to discuss in terms of tips and tricks. A lot of parents have been putting up, quite a number of questions, and a lot of students have been putting up a lot of questions as well, which is really great to see. So I'm just gonna spend some time, collecting that and then answering all of these questions live. Remember, this is the formal Q&A session, and we'll be answering any questions that parents have for the next half an hour. So feel free to put in anything that you wanted some more clarity on, or felt, you just needed, some questions that weren't answered during the session, or anything that's separate to what we spoke about. Put that in the chat, please. And just another reminder to all students and parents. So if you need more exam sets for practice, we have launched our Alpha 1 selective test platform, which you can find on our website. Just go to the resources section on the top right of our website, and you can find test packs that you can purchase. These are sold as either multiple exams for one subject, or you can buy multiple exams for all the subjects to give you the best chance of success, and undertake plenty of practice, under test conditions. Other resources that would be very helpful is, of course, our discussion group. So we do have a Facebook discussion group and also a WeChat discussion group, which has plenty of different resources and worksheets. So feel free to have a look at that, and download all the different resources that we have on those websites. They're really, really helpful. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into the question and answer session. Okay. I'm just loading up the questions. Please bear with me. Okay, first question. Will there be WEMT for year 6 next term? Okay, at Alpha 1, so the year 6 students will be finishing with their selective test towards the beginning of the term. So there won't be WEMT because the test comes up very quickly into term 2. But in term 3, so I should say from term 3 onwards, we will have like our high school classes starting. So for year 6 students, after the selective exam, after you guys have had a bit of a chance to just relax and enjoy some free time after working so hard for your selective test, come term 3, we will have separate English classes and maths classes for year 6 students, just to give you the best chance of success in high school. Remember that there's a big gap between primary school and high school, no matter which school you go to. So we will be having dedicated English and maths classes for year 6 students from year 3 onwards. How many questions can we afford to get wrong? Okay, this is a tricky question because it depends on what your goals and aims are. As a general guide, if you're aiming for one of the competitive selective schools, obviously you want to be making as few mistakes as possible. For reading, a good guide would be anything more than 24 out of 30. For maths, it has 35 questions. Again, only a handful of mistakes is acceptable if you want to get into the most competitive schools. Anything above 28 out of 35 is considered, good. Aim for 30 out of 35 is a bare minimum. If you're going for very competitive schools, thinking skills is really hard. 30 out of 40 is sort of expected. Obviously, the higher your marks, the higher your chances of success. So how many questions can we afford to get wrong? Again, it depends. If you're going for the really, really competitive schools, then as close to none as possible. But hopefully those numbers just give you a rough guide. What is the max questions we can get wrong for each subject and the minimum we can get for writing to get into Balcombe Hills and Girraween? Now, remember, each test paper is weighted differently, right? So reading and maths are weighted at about 25%. Thinking skills is weighted more than that at 35%, and writing is weighted a bit less than that at 15%, right? It doesn't mean that you can bomb your writing section and do really well in just thinking skills and still get into Balcombe Hills, right? The test rewards consistency across all 4 subjects. But like I said, as a general rule, aim for about 25 for reading, 30 for maths, anywhere from 32 to 35 for thinking skills, and then roughly about 18 out of 25 for writing. And that gives you a solid chance of getting into most of the competitive selective schools. Okay. How do you mark your work for writing, and are there any tips on marking your work other than the rubric? Okay, so in terms of marking your work, it really the most useful resource you have is to look at how other people have marked your work. So again, if you've been at Alpha 1 for a while and you've done like the WMT classes and you've submitted your homework for marking, you'll see the way that the markers give you feedback, right? Have a look through exactly what they identified, and have a look at the marking criteria as well. That rubric is the most powerful thing that you have to be able to evaluate your own writing piece. It's structured really well. It's broken down into your technical skills, like your grammar, your punctuation, your spelling, as well as your your writing skills. So in other words, the what you write and the how you write it. In terms of the what you write, the content, that comes down to, the uniqueness of your ideas, the maturity of your ideas, how well you answer the prompt, how much detail you've got packed into each of your body paragraphs. All those things are there in the rubric. Make sure that you can actually write down, one or two things that you've done well, as well as a couple of things that you need to improve on based on the criteria for writing. Okay. Once you've done that, then it's helpful to have someone else have a look through your writing piece after you've made the necessary edits. Otherwise, like I said, over the next few weeks, it's really, really helpful to be able to develop that skill of marking your own writing piece. Another tip of the top performers in the selective exam, these were all students that were exceptionally good at giving themselves feedback, because then on the day of the test, they can write one paragraph, like an introduction, for example, have a quick skim over that introduction, and then say, okay, no, I think I need to change the wording of this sentence, or I need to, rewrite that last sentence, or, I've got good structure and flow. I'm going to try and keep doing that in the next body paragraph, right? The people that can actively reflect on their own writing piece will end up doing very well. So make sure it's a skill that you develop also. Just a quick note about time management for writing. So like I said, they give you 30 minutes now, and you get to fill out 2 A4 pieces of paper. Generally, how you divide that time is you want to spend the first 5 minutes just planning. So you're not writing on any of the lines. You're just spending 5 minutes brainstorming, cutting down your ideas, choosing your best ideas, drawing a tree diagram, or, writing down sentences or lines and then dot points, coming up with a really good plan for 5 minutes. And then you want to spend anywhere from, as a loose guide, 3 to 7 minutes per paragraph. For a tighter guide, roughly about 5 minutes per paragraph for the rest of the piece, right? And that means you'll comfortably finish within 25 minutes. Your introduction typically takes about 5 minutes to write, and it should be roughly about 5 sentences. Each body paragraph is usually about 6 to 7 sentences, and usually takes, again, 5 to 6 minutes. If it's like a fact-based or an opinion-based or a persuasive text, then you can just have a very quick conclusion at the end, which doesn't take you more than, say, 2 or 3 minutes to just, quickly flesh out your main ideas, just, recap on the things that you spoke about in the rest of the piece. But you don't want to be spending like 10 minutes on your conclusion, because it's the paragraph that sort of, matters the least out of all of them. Okay, so roughly about 4 to 6 minutes per paragraph means that you'll finish in about 25 minutes. Can you please explain the table before timekeeping? Okay, let's have a look at that. The table before timekeeping, I'm just flicking back. I'm guessing that is this table here. This is just a structure of the selective test. So you can see that, I've broken it down into reading, maths, thinking skills, and writing, and the number of questions for each one and the time for each one. And like I said before, the sections are weighted differently. So reading is worth the same as maths, thinking skills is worth more than them, and writing is worth a bit less than them. Anyone that wants to get into the nitty-gritty of these weightings, I would say don't worry about it, because it's really not that relevant to students. Remember, the key thing is you have to do your best and perform the best that you can in all the subjects. So don't worry too much about the weighting. But you do have to worry about the time. So remember, reading is a bit more relaxed in terms of time pressure. Maths and thinking skills are very, very tight in terms of time pressure. So make sure you familiarize yourself with these time conditions. School marks, are they still counted? And what about NAPLAN? No, school marks are not counted towards your selective test scores. Nowadays, whatever mark you get in the exam is the only thing that counts towards your final score. They don't actually release your final score. They'll give you a percentile that you get for each subject. So they might say, your child Bob got 10% for reading, so top 10% of students for reading. Then they got in the next 15% of students for maths. Congratulations, they got in the top 10% for thinking skills. Unfortunately, they did very poorly, and they got in the bottom 50% of students for writing. Okay, that's how they report the results. But your school marks, your NAP plan, none of those things count towards the final selective test score, except for special circumstances. Okay. What will be the complexity level in the real exam in comparison with the test we're doing in Alpha 1? It's a good question. I would say that the Alpha 1 exams are a good match for the complexity of the actual selective test. We've gone ahead and looked at previous year's papers, gathered students' thoughts on the tests and things like that. And it's kept pace with the general trends of the selective test, which is that, again, writing is focused more on a variety of different text types. In recent years, the math section, doesn't test a very, advanced level of theory, but it's a test that rewards care and attention to detail. So that's also being accounted for when we write the maths papers. And likewise with thinking skills and writing, thinking skills and reading. Our exams have reflected the changes to the real selective test, like the newer text types that they have, the level of complexity of thinking skills. So I would say it's a fairly close match. A lead on to that a lot of parents ask is, if I want any, advice on which schools I can put down for my child, how can I find out information about how they're performing compared to all the other students? How can I know where my child stands and which schools are realistic? For this one, look, I would say, yes, when children do the mock exams with Alpha 1, like the STTCs or the upcoming April holiday program, we do send out a cohort report that collects all the students' results and gives them a ranking. And that ranking is used to, give you some estimates about schools that are realistic. That list of schools is, again, quite accurate for the majority of students. A small number of students do perform differently on the day of the exam than what was expected. Some students fluctuate a lot in their scores. So if you're looking at those recommended schools from the cohort reports, it also helps to talk to someone about, like which schools might be a good fit for your child. But a lot of times you can take those school recommendations at face value and use that data to help you make an informed decision about schools based on your child's performance. So again, highly recommend doing mock exams for the sake of getting those cohort reports as well for parents. Some parents have also been asking, where can I get extra tests? So here are some resources again. If you go to our website, you can find that we have released our selective trial test platform. So that has a variety of different mock exams that are also written to the standards of the selective test that you can buy. These are online exams, of course. Otherwise, if you want some textbook recommendations, Yvonne Kang's books from 5 Senses are a fairly good match for the real selective test. If you want to see the exact types of questions in the actual selective test, just the way they appeared in previous years, you can go to the Department of Education's website as well, so the New South Wales government website that has the 2021, 22, 23 papers, as well as a sample paper that was released in 2020. Those are, again, the actual tests as they appeared in previous years, and they're very recent. I would highly recommend looking at that website as well. A student question here. Are we allowed to fake statistics for persuasive texts? I would say for this one, try and use reasonably realistic stats. If the question is, let's say the prompt is something about global warming, and then you say something like, scientists have shown that, the Earth's oceans are going to increase by 10 meters over the next 1 year. Or you might say something like 99.99% of species are going to be extinct over the next 5 years because of global warming. Well, that's not very realistic, right? That's not a well-researched statistic. So try and use reasonably accurate statistics that sound accurate enough and sound realistic enough as much as possible for persuasives. I've also seen a lot of students overuse stats. So literally every 2 or 3 sentences will have some sort of statistic in a persuasive. The markers are not too concerned with all these individual statistics. If you have them, it's good because it is a piece of evidence. But remember, there's lots of different pieces of evidence, right? Asking like authorities is a really good piece of evidence, or like mentioning like a logical flow of events is also a really good piece of evidence. Yes, stats are a good piece of evidence, but they're not the only tool that you have in your your skill set. So make sure you use a variety of different qualities of evidence in your persuasives. Don't just, no one wants to see so many numbers come up in any body paragraph in a persuasive. So try and limit them to maybe a couple of stats maximum in any persuasive text. Next question. If you are finishing a sentence in writing after the time finishes, will they deduct marks? Sometimes they'll do something even worse than deduct marks, right? If you are writing and you're struggling to finish off a sentence, and then you need to write you're struggling to finish off your conclusion, you need to write another 1 or 2 sentences in your writing piece, and then the dreaded quote comes up, which is, time up, pencils down, no more writing. If you keep writing after that, there's a good chance that you get 0 for your writing test, right? There's a good chance that they disqualify you for that exam. You do not want to take any chances on the day of the exam. You will put in so much time and effort, in preparing for these tests. The last thing you want is to be caught for like potential cheating or malpractice or anything like that. So don't take any risks. Keep a keen eye on the clock. When you have 5 minutes to go until the completion of the writing test, make sure that you are finishing up your last paragraph and you are starting your conclusion, and make sure that you keep looking at the clock as much as possible, sort of every minute in the last 5 minutes of the exam. And when you notice that there's 1 minute left, finish up your sentence. Some students, have different kinds of strategies. Some students finish writing the whole piece and spend the last 5 minutes going back and editing and checking their work. Other students prefer to take their time through the writing piece and finish pretty much on the dot, but they're more careful as they write. You do whichever strategy works for you. Just do not be writing, up until the very last second. Make sure you wrap things up with roughly about 1 minute to go, so that you're not accused of cheating and continuing to write after the time is up. What kind of watches are allowed in the test venue? I think I explained this one a bit earlier. So, stick with, simple analog watches or very, very simple digital watches if you have anything that fits that description. Do not take any Fitbits or smartwatches or anything that could be used for cheating. And don't rely on it so heavily that you forget to look at the main clock, because the exam hall clock, the one that they put on the wall at the front of the examination hall, that's the one that all the students are expected to use and to manage their time accordingly. Okay. How do I manage my time for maths as I get carried away doing a single question? So same thing, follow the checkpoint method. In your case, for the majority of students, I would recommend dividing the test into quarters, right? So you do about 10 questions every 10 minutes and keep looking at the clock until 10 minutes have gone by, in which case, you should have done 10 questions, and then speed up or slow down according to that. Some students, such as this child here, is asking, how do I avoid getting carried away doing one question for maths? I would recommend give yourself even smaller checkpoints. So aim for something like 5 questions every 5 minutes or something like 5 questions every 5 minutes roughly for maths, and then a bit of time at the end just to check over all your work, right? Then that means that you're basically looking up at the clock periodically. Once 5 minutes have elapsed, you should have done at least 5 questions, right? If you find yourself only having done 2 questions in 5 minutes, then you've already told yourself that you're spending too much time on that one question. So you need to speed up for the next sets of questions and make sure that by the time the 10-minute mark comes around, you've done 7 questions to catch up. So you've done 10 questions in 10 minutes. This way, you don't find that, in the last 10 minutes of the exam, you've only done 15 questions and then, all hope is kind of lost to catch up. Smaller checkpoints could work for some students as well. So try experimenting with that. And that might help you avoiding getting carried away by any single question. Are Fitbits or fitness trackers allowed? Personally, I would not recommend taking Fitbits or fitness trackers because they have additional functionalities. Any watch that has a calculator is not allowed. So don't use any watches that have additional functionalities. Stick with simple devices. Can we wear sports uniform? No, I think you're supposed to wear your academic school uniform. So make sure you pack that. Another question, how to calm nerves during the test? That's a great question. And that's something that, every child struggles with. I know even for me personally, whenever I have, any sort of exam or some sort of, like a stressful situation or something like that, you get very nervous. It's common and natural. Remember, to do this, you're basically trying to, control everything that you can, right? And do worry about the things that you can control. But like I tell every student, like all the students every single year, do not worry about the things that you can't control. So if you go into the morning of the exam, right, have some sort of, mental checklist. have, a couple of quotes that you kind of say to yourself. It could be something motivational or inspirational. For me, like I said, what I used to tell myself was worry about the things you can control. Don't worry about the things that you can't control, right? So what can't you control? You can't control exactly what score you're going to get at the end of the exam. You can't control exactly which school you get into in the selective exam. You can't control how the other students are doing, which questions they're getting correct, which questions they're getting wrong, right? You can't control the traffic that happens on the morning of the exam, or the weather conditions or anything like that, right? So instead, you worry about the things that you can control, which is make sure that you've done enough revision. Make sure that you have a notebook where you keep track of the kinds of mistakes that you make, and make sure you keep revising those mistakes so you avoid making those errors on the day of the test, right? Like I said, keep running through things in your head that you can do. Like, don't forget to plan out your writing response. Remember that a speech's purpose is usually a speech has an agenda. You're trying to communicate something to the audience, or you're trying to convince them about something. You're trying to express your feelings and emotions. They tend to be very strong emotions in a speech. So I'm just kind of having a mental checklist of the key features of different text types, right? Or I'm having a mental checklist of the strategies that I've discovered for closed passages that work well for me, or the strategies that I've come to appreciate for the poems, right? Make sure you run through these kinds of things in your head on the morning of the exam, and you're not running through, again, things that you can't control. Like I said, you're not going to be able to control the traffic on the morning of the test. You can, however, leave home a bit earlier than you normally do. So, these kinds of things will automatically help you control your nerves. A lot of nervousness happens because you're thinking about things that you, again, can't control, and you're thinking about things that, are not helpful in the moment. So, change the script, right? Think about things that you can control and things that will help you feel just a little bit more confident on the morning of the exam. On top of that, like I said before, go back and watch the video again. Make sure that you have a good night's rest. You fall into a good routine before the exam, and you stick with that same routine on the morning of the test as well. What type of writing is most common is the next question. The most common writing type, honestly, there is none. They can give you anything. They could ask you to write an advice sheet, journal entry, guide, like an email or a letter or a speech or a story or a persuasive, discussions, recounts, reviews. They could ask you to write literally any text type. So, you kind of have to know all of them. I wouldn't say any text type is more common than the others. One thing that's reassuring is sometimes you only have to know broad categories of text types. And then there are other text types that fall into those categories. For example, if you know that there's this category called persuasive texts, where your job is to create a logical argument to persuade the person that's reading, then oftentimes, something like a speech, right, or a debate, usually just is a variation of that persuasive, right? If you know that you have to balance both sides of the argument, like a discussion, then again, like a discussion is just a variation of a persuasive, where you're discussing both arguments rather than just focusing on one side of the argument, right? Like a creative or a story, right? Remember, a story has a plot. It has an orientation, and then a complication, and then a resolution, right? Like a thing that starts off the story, a thing that creates problems in the story, and then a part of the story that solves all the issues. And if you have to write like a recount, you're recounting some interesting thing that happened in your life or at the school, it actually kind of follows the same structure, right? If you're writing a letter to someone, and your goal in that letter is, again, to tell them the story of your grandpa, same thing. It has a plot, right? You have a complication and a resolution. So there are certain variations of a story, and they're just kind of manipulating the way that they ask you that. So you can get away with learning these broad categories, but make sure that you actively practice a variety of different text types for writing. This is great. Everyone's asking lots of questions, and hope the answers are helpful. Next one. Should we guess the same answer again and again, or guess different answers? What's the best way to guess answers? I'm guessing this question is about, you've gone through your thinking skills test, and you look at the clock and you realize there's only 1 minute remaining, and you still have about 5 questions left, right? 5 questions that you're not going to attempt. So this student is asking, should I guess every single answer is B, every single answer, like 36, 37, 38, 39, 40 is C, or should I just guess them in like zigzag order? Does it matter at all? Truth is, it doesn't matter. no matter which answer choice you put, if the options are A, B, C, and D, and you're guessing it blindly, you have a 25% chance of getting it correct, right? So it really doesn't matter. You can do it in zigzag order. You can do it in a straight line. You can play, connect 4 with the last couple of questions. Personally, if you ask me, I would say you do not want to be guessing that many questions. So the best way to guess those random answers at the end is to not guess them, and instead, at least as a bare minimum, be able to skim the question and take an educated or informed guess, which you can only do if you follow those checkpoints that we spoke about earlier. So make sure that you practice the correct approaches to these exams under time conditions, so that you're not in a position where you have to guess the last 5 or 10 questions. Okay, should we write a title for writing? Most cases, yes, you should write a title. It doesn't get marked, like they don't pay a lot of close attention to the title. The title is not going to be the thing that boosts your marks from 20 out of 25 to 25 out of 25, or to suddenly jump your scores up from 12 to like 18. But it is really useful for a lot of text types to have to have a title. Some text types expect you to have a title, like a news report pretty much always has a title called the headline. So yeah, there's, you should have a title, but it depends on the type of text that they give you. For the writing paper, will they give you extra paper if you ask? No, you only get 2 A4 pieces of paper, and you have to fill those 2 A4 pieces of paper. And if you need more paper than that, you don't get any extra paper. Every child has the same condition. Every student, the 17,000 students that write the test, only get 2 A4 pieces of paper. So if you are currently used to writing like a 10-page essay, try and get into the habit of only sticking with 2 pieces of paper. Do you go home after the test? I believe you are technically supposed to go back to school after the test. And if you need to go home, then your parents have to raise that with the school. Good news is there's not much time after the exam, right? It usually finishes around 1:30. By the time you get back to school, or by the time lunch finishes, it's 2 o'clock, and then it's only 1 hour at school. Next question. Can we bring a bag to put our pencil case in, or just the necessary items? Can you bring a bag? No, just take the necessary items is what I would say. If you bring like a school bag or like a tote bag or something like that, you're just carrying unnecessary things that are not allowed into the exam. So just carry, my recommendation would be have a clear plastic bottle, and then have a clear plastic sleeve, and put all your stationery in that clear plastic sleeve, as well as your test authority letter. That's really all you need. What text types pop up in the test for reading and writing? I think I've answered the writing one. For reading, most of the years it's a closed passage and a linked extract section for text 3 and 4. Text 1 and 2 typically tends to be a story or a narrative extract, and a and a poem. Okay, so short story, poem, closed passage, and linked extract. That's the usual trend. Truth is, they can technically ask you any text type in the reading paper. In the past, like I'm talking more than the last 3-4 years, it was not uncommon to include news articles, scientific reports, non-fiction articles, speeches, transcripts, interviews, things like that. So they can ask you to write ask you to understand any of those text types. Remember, just be prepared for anything that happens out of the ordinary, including a variety of different text types. But yeah, tips on poems and closed passages, certainly. So for poems, I think it's really useful to find websites that can help, because there are certain websites that give you an analysis of the poem itself, right? In other words, they tell you what the title is talking about, how the title relates to the poem. They talk about the main themes and the, metaphorical ideas in the poem. Remember, poems are hard because they're not like stories that just tell you what's going on. They usually have a deeper layer of meaning, and they usually involve, figurative meaning and metaphors and things like that. So a good website is poemanalysis.com. Or another good thing you can do is go to YouTube and type in, the name of the poem, as well as follow it up with analysis. And there's lots of tutors that are really good at going through the analysis of the poem. Or you can have a look at our YouTube channel, where we would have put up like explanations for poems from past papers and things like that. Okay. Next question. How many subpoints do we need for really good writing for persuasive? Okay, so on average, like I said, aim for 3 body paragraphs and aim for 3 subpoints for each body paragraph, right? That should be the target. If you fall a bit short of that, it's okay, but this should be the aim, because that's what gives you enough breadth that the market can see that you know a lot about this topic. And it also gives you enough, it gives you the breadth to know that you've considered all the different elements of this topic. It also gives you a lot of depth so that the market knows that you're quite knowledgeable in this topic as well. So, subpoints should be about 3 per body paragraph. Can we write an anecdote for writing if it is persuasive? That's really going to depend on the writing text type and, the main thing that they're looking for and things like that. So it depends, would be my answer to that one. An anecdote could be useful if it's not a very scientific piece. And if it's more about like an opinion-based piece, then yes, an anecdote is a very powerful way of convincing people. We'll just wrap up with a couple more questions because I know it's getting late, and we've again, for anyone that needs to leave early, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I hope the session was helpful, and the recording will be available. And if you have a look at the description for this video, you'll find links to a lot of the things that we spoke about today. So, definitely go back and check that out when you can. But yeah, again, thank you to everyone for joining us for this session, and hope you found it helpful. I'll just wrap up with a couple more questions that students have put in. Next question, how do I expand my vocabulary? So vocab is one of those things that, you could learn like 1,000 words this week, and then 1,000 words next week, and 1,000 words the week after that. And on the day of the exam, you get, none of those words ever come up on the test. And that's just because the English language is so broad and there are so many words around that you need an efficient way of studying vocab. So it depends what you're studying vocab for. If you are planning on increasing your vocab for the sake of the reading test, I would recommend to learn about 5 to 10 new words each week, and make sure that you learn at least 3 synonyms for each of those words, okay? Firstly, I'm kind of tricking you into learning more words than you think you're learning. If you think you're learning 5 words and then you learn 3 synonyms for each word, in your head, you're only doing 5 words a week, but in reality, you've done 15 words a week, right? The second thing about that is your brain learns by associating words with each other. When you're learning vocab, it's been proven that you're not just learning individual words, you're learning connections between words, right? If you learn 3 synonyms for each word, it'll help you basically know these words much better. It also means that, you have more words from which to choose from for both your writing section and also your reading section when you're identifying these words. If your purpose is to build up your vocab base for writing, what I would recommend is start by learning the high yield vocab words, right? The things that are highly, highly actionable. So if you learn words such as glacier or like abattoir, these are not, yes, they're fancy words, they're new and interesting words, but how many times are you going to use the word glacier in your writing piece? Or how many times are you going to use the word abattoir in your writing piece? You're probably not, right? Whereas instead, if you look at your, like any writing piece that you've written, and you have a look at common words that you typically use all the time, try and learn synonyms for those common words. And that means that immediately you can start using the vocab that you learn. Let me elaborate. So common words are words that replace verbs, right? Words that replace action words. So in every writing piece, you're going to use verbs like, he said or she said, right? Talked or spoke, shouted, ran, walked, all of these kinds of doing words, these action words or verbs. Every single writing piece is going to have some variation of these verbs. So the best thing that you can do is learn synonyms or better verbs to replace them. Instead of like looked, you might want to use the word gawked, or instead of the word like ran, right? Like he ran down the stairs. You might want to use words like, bolted, right? Like granted, that's not a high level vocab word, but it's still much better than constantly saying run or walk or something like that, right? Another really useful high yield vocab is to use words that replace emotions, right? So instead of saying smiled, instead of saying words like, he was happy or she was sad, try and look up synonyms for the words happy, sad, angry, just common emotions. And it's going to sound a lot more effective if you said that, like Elon was jubilant, right? Sounds much better than Elon was happy. Okay, so that's a great way of expanding your vocab for writing, is to find replacements for your commonly used words. How do we bring our lunch if we are not allowed bags? Helps to just carry like a separate lunch bag, or to have your sandwich and things like that just in a sandwich bag. That would be the easiest way of transporting those things. Will they allow you to go outside during the break? Yes, usually during the big break between your maths paper and thinking skills paper, students are allowed to go outside. That's your chance to eat your lunch. Should we take time off in the days leading up to the exam to avoid falling sick, is the next question. This is a good question, and often it's a very controversial question. For the majority of students, they would not benefit from taking time off before the exam, is what I've observed over the past 10 years. Right? A lot of students, if they were to take the whole day off before the selective exam, so the 8th of May, you stay home, the pressure is really on to do mock exams and undertake lots of test practice, to cram and to study a lot in that time, which actually ends up making the children very nervous. They don't get enough physical activity, they don't get enough contact with their friends, they don't get enough stress relief. Yeah, it's those are things that can actually hurt your chances on the day of the selective exam. So for the majority of students, they benefit from going to school before the exam because it gives them a chance to unwind and relax and talk to their friends and just be in the right headspace before the test. Some students, if you know that you're prone to getting sick, you're already feeling a bit off on say Monday and Tuesday, then it might be worth taking Wednesday off just so that you can recover and feel less sick for the selective test. But to be honest, for most students, they don't benefit from taking time off before the test. But you might be a bit different, and you might actually need that day off before the test and avoid getting sick and things like that. So that's really an individual call to make. Will they ask you to write a poem is the next question. And the truth is, I don't know. Technically, they could ask you to write a poem. There was one scholarship exam that asked the students to write a script for a play. I believe it was the Sydney Grammar Scholarship Test from, maybe 2021 or 2022. So technically, an exam can ask you to do anything. In the case of the Sydney Grammar paper, they asked the students to be William Shakespeare for half an hour. But I haven't seen a poem in the selective test in the past, not just 10 years, but about 15, 20 years. Generally, it's usually the text types that I mentioned earlier. So, stick with learning those ones. If they do ask you to write a poem, well, hopefully, you've done enough practice with poetry that, you at least recognize the main features of that text type and, rely on that to get you through. Okay, that was a really, really, intense Q&A session. There was a lot of different fantastic questions that everyone was asking. So, again, thank you so much for joining us. And, I'm glad that you had a chance to clear up any of those confusions. Remember, if you are still, curious about any of these things, or, you want some more advice, feel free to get in touch with the managers at your local branch, whether it's Parramatta, Bella Vista, Epping, or Burwood. And, I'm sure the staff can help you out with those things. But otherwise, I hope this session was helpful. Thank you all so much for, joining us today. And I wish all of you the very best of luck with your selective test preparation. Thank you guys. A lot of people saying thanks in the comment section. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us today. Are there any word limits for writing? No, there are no word limits. There are only page limits. So maybe, stick with the 2 A4 pieces of paper. Remember, this session is recorded, so you can, feel free to go back and watch the talk again and to just clear up any other confusions you might have. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Bye. I wish you all the very best of luck. Thank you so much. Just hang around for any other last-minute questions. If we are sick on the day, can we do the test on a different day? No. Generally, if you're sick on the day, you need to submit a special considerations request form as soon as you can. It's very rare for students to be doing like catch-up tests or makeup tests or anything like that. So please avoid falling sick in the lead up to the test because they don't really typically have alternatives. Yes, yeah, you're more than welcome to leave now. That was pretty much the entirety of the session. So thank you again for joining. Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear it was helpful. Is the Alpha 1 calculator accurate for school selections? Yes, I would say so. For the majority of students, there's a very high rate of accuracy. Of course, every year we have students that perform not quite as well as expected. In rare cases, they do perform better than expected. So in those situations, yes, the calculator, it can only give you a snapshot of the marks that the children are getting before the exam, or in that particular mock test. If the scores are, if the children themselves are fairly consistent, then the calculator is quite reliable for the majority of cases. But like I said, it would help to talk to someone to actually finalize your school choices, just because there's more to it than just picking 3 schools that show up as green in the cohort reports. But yeah, if you already know, which schools you're aiming for, you understand the thought process behind selecting schools, like, your first choice is an ambitious choice, your second choice is something that's realistic, and your third choice is a backup. You've got good gaps between the cutoffs for each of these schools. You've thought about the location and the distance, and if you're aware of all those different factors, then you can use that calculator to, help you make predictions for which schools are feasible for your child. Absolutely. What happens if you go to a private school? Well, remember, keep an eye on the test authority letter, because that will explain the test venue where you're going to be doing the selective test. Apart from that, private schools typically don't give a lot of information about the selective test, so make sure you keep an eye on the Department of Education's website for any updates, and keep an eye on your portal, so your portal with your login. That'll give you the most up-to-date information, and you just need to periodically keep checking that. But apart from that, there's no difference for whether you go to a private school or a public school for the selective test. Is this talk recorded? Absolutely, this talk is recorded, and we will put this on our YouTube channel. So just go back to YouTube and type in Alpha One Coaching College and check out our YouTube channel. Not only this video, but I would highly recommend also looking through some of our past videos, because we've taken a lot of time to go through past papers and our challenge exams and things like that. Trying to show students different strategies and approaches. So I would definitely recommend adding on the YouTube channel as a useful resource for your practice. Can kids meet parents during the lunch break when they get their lunch? No, most of the time parents aren't allowed inside the school itself. So it's usually, just other students that are going to be there. Can we bring calculators? Absolutely not. Calculators are not allowed in the exam hall. And you are not allowed to have a calculator function on your wristwatch or anything like that. So no calculators. Like I said, if you're going to take a watch, make sure it's a nice, simple watch, simple analog watch. If you want more information, wait until the test authority letter comes out, and keep an eye on the Department of Education's website, where they have an up-to-date list of what things you can and can't bring. But yeah, any smart watches or watches that resemble smartwatches are not allowed. Will there be lines on the A4 writing paper? Yes, there will be lines on the A4 writing paper, but you only get 2 of these A4 pieces of paper. Will the selective test give points to include in the writing is a good question. Yes, in recent years, they have included points. Like for that prompt about the shipping container, it did say you're allowed to talk about, you may want to talk about, the impacts on the beach itself, what the locals are trying to say about it. For the comic book character, it did say things like you might want to include information on how the comic book hero looked like, or what their special powers are. It can give you some tips and some pointers for things that you might want to include. Don't get too reliant on it, because it might also not include that. But as a general rule, if it says, remember, it's all about the details, right? The devil's in the details, as they say. If it says definitely include blah, 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 then you definitely need to include those 3 things. If it says you may want to include, then it's optional. So, in answer to that, they might give you some pointers like that. Most of the years they have given pointers like that. Some years they don't. So just depends on what you might get. Either way, you need to rely on a very good plan when you're planning your when you're coming up with the main ideas of your writing piece. Will the 2 A4 pieces of paper be double-sided? No, usually it's just 2, sides of a piece of paper. I don't know whether it's double-sided or single-sided, but you get 2 A4 sheets to fill out, and they tend to be lined as well. Okay, a couple of last-minute questions on schools and school selection. What is the score to get into a partially selective school? It depends on the partially selective school. Some schools have lower cutoffs compared to others. For example, Parramatta has a fairly high cutoff as far as partially selective schools go. Sefton has a fairly low cutoff as far as partially selective schools go. So it just depends on the partially selective school that you're looking at. If you're curious, you can always have a look at the calculator on our website, which should help put things into perspective. Another student asking, can we get extra sheets of paper? No, you can't. You only get 2 A4 pieces of paper. You can't ask for extra paper usually. If I put Borkham Hills High School as my second choice and another student puts it as the first choice, will they get priority? No. See, what happens is Borkham Hills just gets a list of all the students that put down that school as one of their choices. It doesn't matter if it's a first choice, a second choice, a third choice. They will give it to the first 180 students that are eligible, and then they'll ask other students depending on if anyone says no, and we call that the reserve list. So they don't actually know whether you put it as your first choice or your second choice. They're not concerned with what priority you gave Borkham Hills. You will get the highest offer that you're eligible for, and it shouldn't make a difference whether Borkham Hills is your first choice or your second choice if your mark was high enough to get into that school. How much does handwriting matter in the test? This is a great question. It's one that I can personally talk about because I've never had good handwriting. Your handwriting matters in the sense that they have to be able to read your writing, right? Like if, you've got 2 A4 pieces of paper and it's all just scribbled and the marker is struggling to see what you wrote, they're not going to do very well, right? Just because they can't read the points that you put down. But your handwriting, you don't have to spend so much time making it really, really neat and really, really tidy or write in cursive or anything like that. It needs to be legible, but there are no marks allocated for handwriting or anything like that. So just make sure it's legible. Make sure that it can be read clearly and read quickly. Can you change the school after the test? You absolutely can. The last date to change the school choices, I believe, is 16th of June. I have to double check the dates, and you can find the key dates on the Department of Education's website. But you're allowed to change it up until, at least 1 month after the date of the selective test itself. Like I said, most students perform as expected on the day of the test. Some students perform better than expected. Some students unfortunately perform worse than expected, in which case you can change the school choices as many times as you like up until the 16th of June. How many marks does vocab give you in writing? Okay, writing doesn't work that way. Have a look at our marking criteria, and you can see, how the mark distributions, work. It's not like you start off at 25, you make a spelling mistake, you're at 24, you make a grammar mistake, now it's 23, you use, no fancy vocab, now you get 15. It doesn't work that way. It works in terms of bands. So an average response, falls into the average bands. And then, if it's above average, it goes to the next band. If it's an exceptional writing piece, it goes to the next band after that. That's how it's structured in terms of marking. Vocab is not given any individual marks, but it definitely matters in terms of, the impact that your writing piece creates. There's a big difference in marks between, the students that use detailed, high-level vocabulary, colorful language choices, plenty of creative and literary techniques. The vocab and all these techniques have to be used in the correct way, right? So don't use, don't make up words, don't use words that you don't know the meaning of, don't use words that you've never used before. But if it's used the correct way, these things will have a powerful impact on your final writing score. Now, remember we were talking about drills before. So another drill that might be very helpful for you is just to allocate something like, 10 minutes on a weekday evening, where all you do is just write one paragraph, 5 sentences, talk about anything you want, what's happening outside the window, or like something that happened at school that day. Write 5 sentences about your, new gaming console or a book that you read. It doesn't matter what it is, but your goal is to use an interesting piece of vocab or an interesting and new literary or creative technique in each of these 5 sentences, right? Try doing something like that. It'll give you more practice and help you use these words and techniques, in a much more powerful and effective way. How many questions are there in the maths paper? There are 35 questions in the maths section out of to be done in 40 minutes. Can we bring a highlighter to the reading test? No, stick with your pencil. If you need to highlight things, just underline them with your pencil instead. After we get the results, can we still change schools? Unfortunately, no. The last day to change your school choices is the 16th of June. After that, you are not allowed to touch your school choices or preferences. You don't have that option. And then, after that, your results come out. So the results come out, roughly about 1 to 2 months after you've had the last date to change your school choices. You can't change the choices after the results come out, which is why it's very, very important to make sure that you have a well-informed, well-thought-out selection of schools. Okay. Like I said, school selection is a complex topic, and it's, it takes a lot of planning on its own. Like typically when I, talk to parents about school choices, like at our center in Parramatta, it takes us a good 2 hours to, go through all the different factors that you need to consider. There is a blog post on our website as well as a video that I believe is on our YouTube channel, where you can go through and, have a look at the things to think about when choosing schools, but make sure it's a nice, well-informed decision. Too often, unfortunately, I see parents make some simple mistakes when choosing schools. They've got the schools in the wrong order. It needs to be in the descending order of cutoffs, or how hard it is to get into the school. So, for example, it makes sense to put James Roos as your first choice, Girraween as your second choice, and then Parramatta as your third choice, because that's in descending order of cutoffs. It does not make sense to have Parramatta as your first choice, Baulkham Hills as your second choice, and then, like any other school as your third choice, because it's easier to get into like Parramatta compared to Baulkham Hills. If you have Parramatta as your first choice and Baulkham Hills as your second choice, even if your marks were more than high enough for Baulkham Hills, even if you get full marks in the selective test, you only get the Parramatta offer. So make sure that it's in descending order of cutoffs or minimum entry scores, or how hard it is to get into those schools. Don't put down any schools that you're not planning on attending. For example, if you put down James Roos as your first choice and Girraween as your second choice and Penrith as your third choice, and you really want your child to attend Girraween, you do not want them to attend James Roos, don't put down James Roos as your first choice, because you only get the highest offer that you're eligible for, right? So if your score was high enough to get into James Roos, that's the only offer you're going to get. You will not get a Girraween offer. So if you get the James Roos offer and you don't want it and you reject that offer, then you've rejected all your selective schools. You don't get a Girraween offer at all. So instead, if you really want your child to go to Girraween and not James Roos, put Girraween as your first choice, right? Make sure you do a bit of basic research about the schools. Some schools don't have straightforward names. In the past, I've seen parents put down, say, St. George Girls as their second option. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. St. George Girls is their third option, Sydney Technical as their second option, and Hornsby Girls as their first option, right? That's fine in terms of, the cutoffs and all of those things, but you got to remember that Sydney Tech is a boys only school, right? The other two schools that they've put down are girls only schools. So presumably this parent has a daughter, but because they didn't do the research into the schools, they've put down a boys only school as one of their options. So make sure you don't do that. Do a bit of basic research into the different school choices when choosing schools. Just having a look. Is there any other questions? Let's see. Is there a way I can recognize which questions to skip? Really, really good question. You do need to recognize which questions to skip. Typically, that comes from, knowing which questions to skip comes from doing enough mock exams that you know your own strengths and weaknesses, right? If you know that you're strong with argument and logical reasoning questions for thinking skills, but you're weaker with the maths and problem-solving style of thinking skills questions, then you know that first you need to work on those things before the exam. On the day of the exam, stick with those mathematical problem-solving questions where you can, solve them as best as possible within 2 minutes. If it's taking you much longer than that because it's a natural weakness, then that's worth skipping. It's worth making an educated guess for those questions, okay? Is it a good idea to attempt closed passages before poems? Again, personally, I would recommend going through any exam in order from beginning to end, including for the reading paper. Can we do a tour of the test center before the test day? I think this would depend on the test center itself. Generally speaking, not really, but you can, try driving out to that test center the day before the exam, just so that you know how far away it is and how long it takes to get there. Actually, I wouldn't do it the day before the test. I recommend doing it a week before the exam. For example, if you, let's say you attend West Ryde Public School and your local test center might be Marsden High School or something like that, or Ryde Secondary High School, it might be worth actually driving out to those schools, a week before the exam, just so you know what the commute time and things like that looks like. But they wouldn't typically allow you inside the school itself. Okay. Another student's asking, is it better to guess or to leave the question blank? It is absolutely better to guess. Do not leave any questions blank. Two problems with leaving a question blank. Number one, before I was talking about transcription errors. So if you leave 11 blank, you're supposed to put the answer to question 12 in the bubble for question 12, but now you accidentally put it in the bubble for question 11, right? You put the answer to question 13 in the bubble for question 12. Answer to question 14, bubble for question 13. All of your questions end up being wrong. So don't do that. If just don't leave questions blank. The other problem is by leaving questions blank, you have a 0% chance of getting it correct. But if you take a wild guess, at least you have a 25% or a 20% or a 12.5% chance of getting it correct. So do not leave it blank. Just take a wild guess if you have to. Best to take an educated, informed guess as much as you can. Does the Alpha 1 test paper come in a printable form? I believe the test for our exam platform, I believe they're all online, just because that's the only way that we can actually have a countdown timer to time you and to stop responses after 40 minutes for reading, maths, and thinking skills. And that just simulates the test conditions closely. So I believe it's all online. Okay, I can see the questions have slowed down now. So I'm just going to end this stream. Again, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. Really hope it was helpful, and thank you all so much for such insightful questions. I hope this is a valuable resource for you to go back and continue to use over the next few weeks. And I wish you all the very best of luck with the selective test itself, as well as your future academic endeavors. Bye. Thank you.